Hey there, sleepy wasteland wanderers. Tonight, we're diving into the haunting beauty of the Fallout universe, where broken cities whisper forgotten stories, and every shadow hides a tale of survival. I'll be your guide through these glowing ruins, sharing quiet moments of hope, resilience, and the eerie calm of a world long gone. Welcome, wanderer, to the quiet aftermath of a world that refused to stay dead, where hope was rebuilt not through empires or machines, but through scattered hands trying to hold the pieces together. Tonight, we follow the Minutemen, a fragile network of volunteers, survivors, and broken soldiers stretched across the ruins of the Commonwealth as they attempt something almost impossible in the wasteland: to protect everyone, everywhere, with almost nothing at all. This is a story about idealism under pressure, about kindness stretched beyond its limits, about what happens when the desire to help becomes a system too weak to carry the weight of a collapsing world. It is about Preston Garvey's endless calls for aid, about the sole survivor becoming an unwilling pillar of stability, and about a faction that refuses to become an empire even when the wasteland quietly demands one. So settle in, let your thoughts slow, and drift into the broken roads of post-war Boston, where every settlement is a promise, every distress signal a burden, and every act of mercy comes with a cost that never stops accumulating. In the Commonwealth, help is always needed, and it never truly ends. The Minutemen are probably the easiest faction in the Commonwealth to love. They do not enslave people, they do not replace citizens with synths, they do not arrive in giant airships demanding obedience at gunpoint. They just want to help. And maybe that is exactly the problem, because when you strip away the comforting speeches, the revolutionary imagery, and the endless promises about rebuilding the Commonwealth, what you are left with is a faction that repeatedly collapses, repeatedly fails the people depending on it, and ultimately survives only because one absurdly capable stranger drags it forward alone. The Minutemen are not evil, but they may be the worst long-term hope for civilization in all of Fallout. The Commonwealth Minutemen were built on one incredibly powerful idea: not technology, not conquest, not fear, just ordinary people protecting each other because nobody else would. And honestly, when you first hear that idea, it sounds almost impossible to dislike. The wasteland of the Commonwealth is brutal even by Fallout standards. Raiders infest entire highways, super mutants drag people into ruined buildings to butcher and eat them. Gunners sell violence to the highest bidder. Synth paranoia poisons entire communities. Every settlement exists in a permanent state of anxiety, knowing that one bad night could erase everything they have built. Most people in the Commonwealth are not heroes. They are exhausted farmers trying to survive another winter without getting shot. So when the Minutemen first emerged, people saw something they had not seen in generations. Not conquerors, not rulers, not scavengers, protectors. The name itself matters here. The Minutemen deliberately modeled themselves after the colonial militias of early American history, citizens who would supposedly be ready at a minute's notice to defend their neighbors. It is a deeply romantic idea, especially in the context of Fallout, a universe absolutely obsessed with the mythology of America. The faction wrapped itself in symbols of community, sacrifice, and revolutionary virtue. They were not meant to be kings. They were not meant to be an occupying army. They were supposed to be regular people standing together against chaos. And for a while, it actually worked. That part is important. The Minutemen were not always pathetic. Players sometimes forget this, because by the time the sole survivor encounters them, the organization is basically a handful of traumatized refugees hiding inside a museum. But historically, the Minutemen were once one of the most respected forces in the Commonwealth. Settlements trusted them, farmers believed in them, entire communities depended on them. Long before Preston Garvey started marking settlements on your map every 7 minutes, the Minutemen had built a reputation as reliable defenders of the people. Raiders feared them, traders respected them. They represented the closest thing the Commonwealth had to collective security, and in a wasteland defined by distrust, that reputation meant everything. because most factions in Fallout operate through coercion. The Brotherhood of Steel preserves order through overwhelming military force. The Institute operates through secrecy, manipulation, and technological superiority. The Railroad survives through paranoia and hidden networks. Every major faction in Fallout understands one ugly truth about post-apocalyptic civilization. Stability usually requires power concentrated in the hands of a few people willing to use it. The Minutemen rejected that philosophy entirely. Their entire identity rested on decentralization, communities helping communities, volunteers protecting volunteers, cooperation without tyranny, and emotionally, that idea is incredibly attractive, especially to players, because the Minutemen fulfill a fantasy that many people instinctively want to believe. The fantasy that ordinary people, if they simply cared enough about one another, could rebuild civilization without becoming monsters themselves. No authoritarianism, no dictatorship, no secret police, no techno-elitism. Just neighbors standing shoulder to shoulder against the darkness. In another setting, that might even work, but Fallout is not another setting. The Commonwealth is not a damaged society waiting to recover naturally. It is a violently fragmented region shaped by 2 centuries of collapse. People do not trust each other because history has taught them not to. Entire towns vanish overnight. Raiders torture settlers for fun. Mercenary companies wipe out communities for caps. Even basic communication between settlements is dangerous because traveling a few miles can get you killed. And this is where the first major contradiction inside the Minutemen begins to appear. The Minutemen believed they could create stability without central authority. They believed goodwill alone could hold the Commonwealth together. But goodwill is fragile, especially in a world like Fallout. Still, before everything collapsed, people desperately wanted the Minutemen to succeed. That desperation is a huge part of why the faction became so beloved in-universe. The Commonwealth had already seen what the alternatives looked like. The Institute hid underground while conducting horrifying experiments on the surface population. The Brotherhood historically treated outsiders as lesser beings, unworthy of advanced technology. Raider gangs ruled through terror. Even local governments repeatedly failed to organize lasting cooperation. The Minutemen seemed different, not because they were powerful, because they were approachable. A farmer could become a Minuteman. A trader could call for their help. A settlement could request protection without surrendering independence. They were less a government and more a promise. The promise that somebody would answer when things went wrong. And psychologically, that matters. People living in constant fear do not just need security. They need hope. They need to believe that someone out there still cares whether they live or die. The Minutemen gave the Commonwealth that emotional reassurance. You can actually see traces of this throughout Fallout 4's environmental storytelling. Settlements talk about the Minutemen almost nostalgically, even after the faction collapses. Older survivors remember them as symbols of better days. Traders mention how roads were safer when Minutemen patrols existed. People remember the idea of the Minutemen long after the organization itself stops functioning. That distinction becomes extremely important later, because the Minutemen survive as mythology far longer than they survive as an institution. But during their peak, that mythology was powerful enough to inspire genuine cooperation. Settlements shared resources more willingly. Trade routes became safer. Communities believed that somebody might actually come help them if raiders attacked. For perhaps the first time since the bombs fell, the Commonwealth started imagining itself as more than isolated pockets of survivors. And honestly, you can understand why. The Minutemen represented a version of post-war civilization that did not require surrendering humanity. That is the emotional core of the faction. Every other major power in Fallout asks people to compromise something fundamental. The Brotherhood asks for obedience. The Institute asks for moral blindness. The Railroad asks for secrecy and sacrifice. But the Minutemen ask people to believe in each other. That is incredibly seductive, especially in a franchise as cynical as Fallout. Even their aesthetic reinforces this emotional appeal. Their armor looks improvised rather than oppressive. Their weapons feel practical instead of ceremonial. Their headquarters in the castle evokes revolutionary history rather than imperial domination. Everything about the faction is designed to communicate familiarity rather than authority, and Preston Garvey embodies that perfectly. Preston does not speak like a conqueror. He speaks like an exhausted humanitarian worker, barely holding himself together. He constantly frames the Minutemen in moral language rather than political language, helping settlements, protecting people, doing the right thing. There is something deeply sincere about him, and sincerity is rare in Fallout. Most factions in the series are layered in hypocrisy, manipulation, or ideological extremism. Preston genuinely seems to believe that enough decent people working together can slowly heal the Commonwealth. He is not secretly trying to seize power. He is not manipulating anyone for personal gain. He is just desperately trying to keep civilization from disappearing completely. That sincerity makes the Minutemen emotionally difficult to criticize, because attacking the faction can feel like attacking kindness itself. But kindness and effectiveness are not the same thing. That is the central tragedy of the Minutemen. Their ideology sounds beautiful precisely because it avoids the brutal questions civilization eventually has to answer. Who enforces laws? Who controls resources? Who coordinates defense? Who punishes betrayal? Who compels settlements to contribute when sacrifice becomes necessary? The Minutemen never develop satisfying answers to these questions because they are fundamentally uncomfortable with centralized power. They want all the benefits of organized civilization without adopting the structures that historically allow civilizations to survive. And early on, that weakness is hidden because the faction operates during a period where optimism still exists. Communities are willing to cooperate voluntarily because they believe everyone shares the same goals. But over time, cracks begin to form. Some settlements contribute more than others. Some commanders become selfish. Some communities stop helping entirely while still expecting protection. And because the Minutemen lack strong institutional authority, they cannot effectively stop any of this. The organization depends almost entirely on trust, and trust erodes quickly in desperate environments. But before the collapse fully arrived, most people ignored these warning signs because emotionally, the Minutemen still represented the Commonwealth at its best. That emotional symbolism cannot be overstated. The Commonwealth is a deeply lonely place. Most survivors experience life through tiny, isolated communities where fear shapes every decision. The Minutemen challenged that isolation. They told people they were part of something larger, that somebody beyond their settlement walls still cared about their survival. That matters even if the system itself is weak, maybe especially because the system is weak. Human beings are often drawn toward hopeful ideas, precisely when reality becomes unbearable. The Minutemen gave exhausted people permission to believe the wasteland was not destined to remain horrific forever, and for a brief moment, that hope seemed justified. The Minutemen helped settlements survive attacks. They escorted caravans. They fought raiders. They responded to emergencies. They built relationships across the Commonwealth. Piece by piece, they started becoming more than just scattered volunteers with rifles. They became the symbolic heart of a possible future. But the problem with symbolic hearts is that eventually they must pump real blood. Sooner or later, every idealistic movement encounters pressure strong enough to expose whether it possesses actual structural strength beneath the rhetoric. The Minutemen were no exception, because while they claimed to represent unity, the Commonwealth itself remained deeply divided. Settlements still prioritized their own survival above regional stability. Leaders still argued. Resources remained scarce. Raiders kept growing stronger. Mercenary groups became more organized. Fear never truly disappeared. And beneath the hopeful speeches, the Minutemen were slowly discovering something terrifying. Protecting people occasionally is not the same thing as governing a civilization. A militia can repel raiders. That does not mean it can build a nation. And the closer the Minutemen moved toward becoming the Commonwealth's primary stabilizing force, the more obvious their weaknesses became. Their decentralized structure, once viewed as proof of moral purity, slowly transformed into a logistical nightmare. Coordination became inconsistent, leadership became fragmented. Different groups interpreted the Minutemen mission differently. Some commanders were competent, others were selfish opportunists, more interested in local power than regional survival. But the organization had almost no mechanisms for correcting these failures. Because accountability requires authority, and authority was exactly what the Minutemen feared becoming. This is the paradox sitting at the center of the entire faction. The Minutemen wanted to avoid becoming tyrants so badly that they built a system too weak to reliably defend the people depending on it. They wanted freedom without hierarchy, security without enforcement, civilization without centralized control, and history, both real and fictional, is not usually kind to systems built entirely on voluntary cooperation during periods of extreme instability. Still, the dream survived longer than it probably should have, because people needed it to survive. That is the heartbreaking thing about the Minutemen. Even when the organization was already beginning to rot internally, ordinary settlers still clung to the idea that somebody out there might help them. The Minutemen became less a functioning institution and more an emotional lifeline, a symbol that civilization had not completely surrendered to brutality. And maybe that is why so many players instinctively side with them during Fallout 4. Not because they appear strongest, not because they appear smartest, but because they appear human. The Brotherhood intimidates people, the Institute alienates people, the Railroad isolates itself from the wider population, but the Minutemen feel emotionally accessible. They represent the comforting fantasy that normal, decent individuals can overcome systemic collapse through cooperation and compassion. It is a beautiful fantasy, possibly the most beautiful fantasy in all of Fallout. But as the Commonwealth would eventually discover, beautiful fantasies do not stop bullets. The Quincy massacre is usually treated as the moment the Minutemen died, but Quincy was not the cause of the collapse. Quincy was the autopsy. By the time the Minutemen made their final stand there, the organization was already hollowed out from the inside. The ideals still existed. The flags still flew. The radio broadcasts still spoke about unity and protection and rebuilding the Commonwealth. But underneath all of that optimism, the foundation had already started crumbling years earlier. And that matters because it completely changes how we interpret the faction. The popular version of the story is simple. Brave defenders got overwhelmed by tragedy. A noble organization suffered one catastrophic defeat and never recovered. But the reality is uglier. The Minutemen did not collapse because they lost one battle. They lost one battle because they were already collapsing. You can actually trace the deterioration step by step if you look carefully at the lore surrounding the Commonwealth before Fallout 4 begins. Even during the faction's so-called Golden Age, the cracks were already visible. Different Minutemen groups operated semi-independently across the region. Settlements cooperated inconsistently. Leadership depended heavily on personalities rather than systems. Communities expected protection but often resisted sacrifice. And as conditions in the Commonwealth worsened, these weaknesses became impossible to ignore. The Minutemen were designed around voluntary cooperation. That sounds admirable until resources become scarce. Then suddenly, every settlement starts asking the same question. Why should we risk our people for somebody else? And once that question enters the equation, everything becomes unstable. This is one of the most realistic parts of the faction, honestly. Fallout understands something deeply uncomfortable about human societies during collapse. People talk about unity during periods of relative safety. But when survival becomes uncertain, communities almost always become more insular. Fear narrows moral concern. Settlements stop thinking regionally and start thinking locally. Protecting your own people becomes more important than abstract ideals about collective civilization. The Minutemen had no real mechanism to overcome this instinct. They could inspire cooperation, they could not enforce it. And eventually, inspiration stopped being enough. The death of General Becker accelerated everything. Becker is one of those figures in Fallout lore who feels strangely ghost-like. We never meet him directly, but his absence hangs over the entire story of the Minutemen. By most accounts, Becker was one of the last leaders capable of holding the organization together. Not because the Minutemen suddenly developed strong institutions under him, but because his personal authority temporarily compensated for the faction's structural weakness. That distinction is critical. Strong organizations survive leadership transitions. Weak organizations survive only as long as exceptional individuals hold them together. When Becker died, the Minutemen immediately started fracturing because there was no durable system beneath his leadership, no stable succession process, no strong centralized administration, no universally respected command hierarchy. Different leaders competed for influence. Regional interests diverged. Communities started prioritizing themselves again. And suddenly the faction that once symbolized unity became consumed by internal division. This happens constantly throughout history. Organizations built entirely around goodwill and charismatic leadership often appear stable right until the moment those leaders disappear. Then, everything falls apart at terrifying speed because nobody ever solved the deeper institutional problems underneath. The Minutemen are basically this phenomenon weaponized into an entire faction. After Becker's death, the Commonwealth did not unite behind a clear successor. Instead, competing figures struggled to maintain authority over increasingly fragmented territory. Some Minutemen leaders still genuinely believed in the cause. Others became selfish, territorial, or openly corrupt. And corruption inside the Minutemen feels especially devastating because the faction's entire identity depends on moral credibility. The Brotherhood can survive accusations of authoritarianism because authoritarianism is already part of their structure. The Institute survives secrecy because secrecy defines the organization. But the Minutemen are supposed to represent ordinary, decent people, cooperating voluntarily for the common good. So when Minutemen leaders start acting selfishly, it poisons the entire myth. Because if even the Minutemen cannot stay united, what hope does the Commonwealth really have? That psychological damage mattered enormously. People often focus on the military collapse of the faction while ignoring the emotional collapse happening simultaneously. The Commonwealth stopped believing in the Minutemen before the organization fully disintegrated physically. Settlements became skeptical, confidence eroded. Every failed response, every delayed reinforcement, every internal disagreement weakened public trust further. And once trust starts collapsing in a decentralized system, recovery becomes incredibly difficult. Because trust is basically the only thing holding everything together. This is where the Gunners become such an important contrast. The Gunners are brutal mercenaries, but structurally, they are everything the Minutemen are not: organized, disciplined, professionalized, clear chains of command, clear financial incentives, unified operations. They do not pretend to be morally righteous. They do not rely on idealism. They function because they understand violence as logistics rather than philosophy, and that makes them terrifyingly effective. When the Minutemen encountered increasingly organized threats, their weaknesses became impossible to hide. Raiders were one thing. Scattered gangs could be fought through localized volunteer action. But the Commonwealth was evolving into something more dangerous. Better armed groups started appearing, super mutant populations expanded, mercenary organizations consolidated power. The environment became more militarized and more sophisticated. Meanwhile, the Minutemen still operated like an improvised emergency response network, pretending to be a government. The contradiction became fatal. Quincy exposed this more brutally than anywhere else. By the time the battle happened, the town had become one of the last major strongholds, still loyal to the Minutemen cause. Civilians fled there believing it would be protected. The defenders expected reinforcements from other Minutemen groups across the Commonwealth. And those reinforcements never came. Think about how catastrophic that is psychologically. The Minutemen were not just soldiers, They were an idea, the promise that communities would stand together instead of abandoning one another. Quincy shattered that promise permanently. Because when the crisis arrived, the Commonwealth behaved exactly the way frightened, fragmented societies usually behave. Everybody protected themselves first. Nearby settlements hesitated to help. Some Minutemen groups refused to commit forces, others delayed, others simply vanished. And while civilians desperately waited for aid that never arrived, the gunners attacked with overwhelming force. Then Clint betrayed them. That betrayal feels symbolic on almost every level. Clint was not merely a traitor, he represented the collapse of belief itself. A veteran Minuteman officer abandoning the faction to join the gunners perfectly encapsulates the entire ideological failure of the organization. He chose structure over idealism, stability over loyalty, power over hope, and horrifyingly, from a purely pragmatic perspective, his decision almost makes sense. The gunners offered something the Minutemen increasingly could not: survival. That is the devastating thing about institutional collapse. Eventually, morality starts losing against competence. Desperate people gravitate toward whatever actually functions. And by the final years before Quincy, the Minutemen increasingly looked like a movement running on nostalgia instead of capability. The battle itself became a massacre. Civilians died, defenders were slaughtered, survivors scattered across the Commonwealth carrying trauma, bitterness, and guilt. The organization effectively ceased to exist afterward, not officially, not ceremonially. It simply dissolved into fear and exhaustion, and that is probably the most realistic detail of all. Most civilizations do not collapse with dramatic final speeches. They collapse through gradual abandonment. People stop believing, stop cooperating, stop sacrificing. Institutions hollow out slowly until one final crisis exposes how little remained underneath. That is Quincy, not the death of the Minutemen, the revelation that they were already dead. Preston Garvey survives this destruction physically, but psychologically he never really escapes it. When players first meet him inside the Museum of Freedom, he already sounds emotionally exhausted. There is desperation underneath every line of dialogue. He clings to the Minutemen identity because without it, the entire tragedy becomes unbearable. And honestly, Preston is one of the saddest characters in Fallout, precisely because he understands more than he admits. He knows the Commonwealth abandoned the Minutemen. He knows settlements refused to help. He knows the organization failed catastrophically. But he cannot let himself fully acknowledge what that means, because the Minutemen are tied directly to his understanding of human goodness. If the Minutemen were fundamentally doomed, then maybe the Commonwealth itself is doomed too. So Preston keeps believing, even after everything, especially after everything. That persistence is admirable in human terms. It is horrifying in political terms, because Preston responds to systemic collapse entirely through personal morality. He believes the solution to institutional weakness is simply finding more decent people willing to help, more volunteers, more kindness, more cooperation. But structural failures do not disappear because individuals mean well. And this becomes painfully obvious when you look at how the faction behaves after Quincy. The surviving remnants possess almost no capacity for recovery on their own. They have no reserve infrastructure, no hidden command structure, no stable fallback systems. Everything depends on isolated survivors improvising constantly. The Minutemen collapse with astonishing speed because there was never enough institutional depth beneath the rhetoric. Compare that to factions like the Brotherhood of Steel. The Brotherhood can lose entire chapters and still survive because the organization possesses durable traditions, command hierarchies, training systems, logistical networks, and ideological cohesion. The Institute survives underground for generations because it built resilient systems. Even the Railroad survives through compartmentalized cells and operational secrecy. The Minutemen survive through vibes. And vibes are not enough when people with plasma rifles start shooting at you. That sounds cynical, but Fallout itself repeatedly demonstrates this point. The wasteland consistently rewards organized power over decentralized idealism. Every stable force in the series relies on hierarchy, discipline, and centralized coordination to some extent. The Minutemen attempt to bypass these requirements through moral optimism. The Commonwealth eventually punishes them for it. And maybe the cruelest part is that ordinary people suffer the consequences most directly. Settlers trusted the Minutemen, families relied on them. Communities organized themselves around the belief that collective defense could work. So when the organization collapsed, the damage extended far beyond military defeat. The Commonwealth lost faith in the possibility of regional unity itself. That psychological wound is massive. After Quincy, people become more isolated, more distrustful, more cynical. Settlements retreat inward again. Cooperation declines. Fear expands. The dream of rebuilding a connected civilization starts feeling naive instead of achievable. In many ways, the Minutemen did not just fail militarily. They made hope itself look foolish. And once hope starts looking foolish, societies become very hard to save. That is why the early stages of Fallout 4 feel so bleak, despite the hopeful tone Preston constantly tries to maintain. The Commonwealth is full of survivors who have already seen idealism collapse once before. Many settlements no longer trust promises about unity because they remember what happened the last time someone made those promises. This is also why the sole survivor's arrival feels almost mythological within the narrative. The player does not merely rebuild the Minutemen. The player temporarily restores belief in the possibility of cooperation. But even then, the entire process depends on one absurdly capable outsider personally solving every crisis, which quietly reinforces the exact same structural weakness that destroyed the faction before. The Minutemen never truly solve their dependency problems. They just replace one failing structure with another centered around the player. And beneath all the rebuilding, all the artillery cannons, all the settlement quests, the same terrifying question still lingers over the Commonwealth. What happens when the hero disappears again? Because eventually, every hero does. Preston Garvey almost feels like the Commonwealth itself compressed into one person. Exhausted, idealistic, traumatized, still trying to believe anyway. When people talk about Preston online, the conversation usually becomes a joke almost immediately. Another settlement needs your help. Endless radiant quests, constant interruptions, a walking meme trapped inside an infinite cycle of emergency management. But honestly, the reason Preston became a meme is because he accidentally reveals the entire truth about the Minutemen. The faction is trapped in permanent crisis response mode. That is not just a gameplay mechanic, that is the philosophy. Preston never talks about building functioning institutions. He rarely discusses long-term governance. He does not outline systems of taxation, agriculture, manufacturing, law, or regional administration. His worldview revolves almost entirely around immediate humanitarian action. Somebody is suffering. Somebody needs protection. Somebody needs help right now. And morally, that instinct is beautiful. Strategically, it is catastrophic, because civilizations cannot survive forever in emergency mode. At some point, societies must transition from reactive survival to stable organization. They must build systems that continue functioning, even when heroic individuals are absent. The Minutemen never really make this transition, because Preston himself does not fully understand the difference between helping people and governing civilization. And honestly, why would he? Look at his life. Preston grew up in the Commonwealth after civilization had already collapsed completely. His entire existence was shaped by instability. Violence was normal. Communities disappeared constantly. Safety was temporary. He never experienced functioning government institutions firsthand. He never saw a stable nation operating successfully. His understanding of leadership comes entirely from survival and mutual aid. That context matters enormously. Preston is not naive because he is unintelligent. He is naive because the Commonwealth trained him to think small, not morally small, structurally small. In a world where every day is a struggle to survive, long-term institution building becomes difficult to even imagine. People focus on immediate suffering because immediate suffering is everywhere. Raiders attacking settlements, crops failing, caravans disappearing, friends dying, communities collapsing. Preston learned leadership through triage, and triage is not the same thing as governance. This is why he responds to nearly every problem the same way. Send help, defend settlers, rescue hostages, clear raiders, protect farms, repeat forever. Again, morally admirable, but the deeper issue never changes. Why do these settlements remain so vulnerable in the first place? Why does every community require constant external rescue? Why has the Commonwealth failed to establish durable security after 2 centuries? Preston rarely asks these questions because his worldview is rooted in immediate compassion rather than systemic analysis. And to be fair, that compassion is genuine. That sincerity is what makes him compelling. Unlike many Fallout characters, Preston does not hide selfish motives behind ideological language. He truly wants to help people. He believes deeply in collective responsibility. He genuinely sees the Minutemen as a force for good rather than personal advancement. There is no cynicism in him. In Fallout, that almost feels unnatural. Most characters in the series operate through compromise, manipulation, or moral ambiguity. Preston stands out because he still believes basic decency matters. Even after Quincy, even after betrayal, even after watching the Commonwealth abandon itself, that emotional resilience is remarkable, but it also blinds him, because Preston consistently interprets structural problems as moral problems. If settlements are weak, people need more help. If cooperation fails, people need more inspiration. If the Minutemen collapse, good people simply need to try harder. He never fully confronts the possibility that the organizational model itself may be fundamentally flawed. And honestly, the game quietly supports this criticism constantly. Think about how dependent Preston becomes on the sole survivor almost immediately. Within an incredibly short period of time, he effectively transfers the burden of rebuilding the entire Commonwealth onto one stranger he met inside a museum. General of the Minutemen, builder of settlements, military commander, diplomat, problem solver, supply line manager, raider exterminator. It is absurd. And Preston barely seems to question it because his understanding of leadership is deeply personal rather than institutional. He believes strong individuals can inspire collective action, which is true to some extent. But strong institutions matter far more than strong individuals over long periods of time. The Minutemen consistently confuse these two things. They rely on heroes instead of systems, and heroes eventually fail. That is one reason Preston's optimism feels so emotionally exhausting throughout Fallout 4. He constantly speaks as though enough kindness and determination can overcome structural collapse. But the Commonwealth repeatedly demonstrates the opposite. Violence, fragmentation, and distrust persist regardless of good intentions because the underlying material conditions remain unstable. The farms remain vulnerable, trade remains dangerous, infrastructure barely exists, communication is inconsistent, settlements remain isolated, and despite all the emotional speeches about rebuilding, the Minutemen never fully address these foundational weaknesses. Instead, they become trapped in endless maintenance of disorder. This is actually why the settlement system in Fallout 4 unintentionally supports the critique of the faction so perfectly. Every settlement feels temporary, fragile, constantly under threat. Even heavily developed communities still rely on the player personally solving crises. Raiders attack forever, resources remain inconsistent, defenses never create genuine regional stability. The Commonwealth does not evolve into civilization. It evolves into a network of permanently stressed out survival camps. And Preston treats this as progress. Again, not because he is stupid, because he genuinely cannot imagine anything larger anymore. Quincy destroyed something inside him psychologically. Before the massacre, Preston still believed the Minutemen represented an unstoppable moral force capable of slowly healing the Commonwealth. After Quincy, his optimism becomes more desperate, more fragile. He clings to the ideology because the alternative is emotionally unbearable. Imagine surviving that collapse, watching civilians die while reinforcements never arrive, watching trusted allies betray the organization, watching communities abandon each other, watching hope itself disintegrate in real time. Preston should probably become cynical after that. Most people would. Instead, he doubles down on idealism because it is the only thing preventing complete despair. That makes him deeply human. It also makes him incredibly dangerous as a political thinker. Because Preston's philosophy contains almost no safeguards against failure, everything depends on individuals remaining morally committed indefinitely. There are no strong enforcement mechanisms, no robust institutional structures, no realistic contingency plans for betrayal, corruption, or apathy. He simply believes enough decent people can sustain civilization voluntarily. History usually disagrees, and Fallout definitely disagrees. That does not mean Preston is worthless. In many ways, he is probably one of the best human beings in the entire Commonwealth. He shows empathy consistently. He risks his life for strangers. He refuses to surrender completely to cruelty despite overwhelming trauma. Compared to most wasteland leaders, he is extraordinarily compassionate. But compassion alone cannot stabilize societies. This becomes especially obvious whenever Preston talks about freedom. The Minutemen pride themselves on respecting local autonomy. Settlements govern themselves. Communities maintain independence. Nobody gets forced into obedience. Again, emotionally appealing. But decentralized freedom creates enormous coordination problems during crises. Settlements expect protection while resisting external control. Resources become fragmented. Defense becomes inconsistent. Regional planning becomes nearly impossible. Preston sees this decentralization as proof of moral legitimacy. He never fully grapples with its logistical consequences, and that tension defines almost every aspect of the Minutemen. They want all the benefits of civilization without exercising the authority civilization usually requires. They want unified defense without centralized command, shared security without mandatory contribution, regional cooperation without enforcement, hope without sacrifice. Preston embodies this contradiction perfectly because emotionally he understands suffering, but institutionally he understands almost nothing, which sounds harsh, but think about it carefully. When Preston rebuilds the Minutemen with the sole survivor, what actually changes structurally from the old organization? Very little. The same decentralized settlement model remains. The same dependence on volunteerism remains. The same weak administrative systems remain. The same logistical fragility remains. The player simply compensates for these weaknesses through superhuman competence. And Preston mistakes this temporary stabilization for proof the ideology works. But systems that require exceptional heroes are usually broken systems. This is why Preston's famous settlement quests feel strangely depressing after a while. They create the sensation of endless, unresolved instability. No matter how much progress the player makes, another emergency always appears. Another settlement needs rescue. Another caravan route becomes unsafe. Another farm gets attacked. The Commonwealth never feels truly stabilized because the Minutemen never develop beyond reactive defense, and Preston cannot imagine another model. Not because he lacks intelligence, because his moral worldview prioritizes immediate human suffering above abstract structural planning. Every crisis feels urgent because in the wasteland, every crisis is urgent. But constantly responding to emergencies prevents the organization from evolving beyond emergency response. The Minutemen become trapped in an infinite cycle of humanitarian firefighting. Meanwhile, larger systemic threats continue festering underneath. And maybe that is why Preston feels so strangely tragic by the end of Fallout 4. He achieves his dream on paper. The Minutemen return, settlements cooperate again. The castle is reclaimed. Raiders are pushed back. Hope returns to the Commonwealth, but even then, the deeper instability remains unresolved. The entire rebuilt Commonwealth still depends heavily on one central heroic figure. The settlements remain loosely connected rather than truly unified. The infrastructure remains primitive. The economy remains fragile. The political structure barely exists. The Minutemen survive emotionally more than institutionally, and Preston either cannot see this fully or refuses to, because if he admitted the truth completely, he would have to confront something horrifying. Maybe the Commonwealth cannot be saved through kindness alone. Maybe good intentions are not enough. Maybe helping people survive day by day is different from building a civilization capable of surviving centuries. And maybe the Minutemen, despite all their sincerity, were always doomed by the very ideals that made them lovable in the first place. The most devastating critique of the Minutemen is not that they are evil, it is that they might actually be impossible. Not morally impossible, structurally impossible. When people think about why civilizations survive, they usually imagine military strength first: armies, weapons, fortifications, technology. But, historically, civilizations are really held together by less glamorous things: tax systems, food distribution, bureaucracy, infrastructure, communication networks, supply chains, legal authority, administrative coordination. None of this is exciting. All of it matters more than heroism, and the Minutemen barely possess any of it. That is the core structural problem, hiding underneath the faction's emotional appeal. They function more like a loose volunteer association than a sustainable state, which works temporarily during localized crises, but begins collapsing immediately once pressure intensifies regionally, because decentralized militias are very good at symbolic resistance. They are usually terrible at maintaining long-term stability. The Commonwealth Minutemen never fully evolve beyond the militia phase. That becomes obvious the moment you start examining how the organization actually operates beneath the inspirational rhetoric. Take taxation, for example, or rather, the complete absence of taxation. This sounds boring compared to discussions about synths or power armor, but it is one of the single most important details in understanding why the Minutemen repeatedly fail. Stable governments require predictable resource extraction. Armies need food. Defenses need maintenance. Infrastructure requires labor and material investment. Communication systems need funding. None of this sustains itself through goodwill alone. The Minutemen never establish reliable mechanisms for mandatory contribution. Everything depends on voluntary cooperation, and voluntary systems become dangerously unstable during prolonged hardship. Settlements expect protection from the Minutemen, but what exactly are they required to provide in return? The answer seems wildly inconsistent. Some communities contribute manpower, others provide crops. Others appear to do almost nothing while still benefiting from regional defense. This creates an enormous free rider problem. Why sacrifice resources if neighboring settlements might avoid contributing while still receiving protection? Historically, this issue destroys decentralized coalitions constantly. Shared defense works only when contribution becomes predictable and enforceable. Otherwise, cooperation gradually collapses into resentment. Some groups overextend themselves while others withdraw inward. Trust deteriorates. Collective security weakens, which is basically the history of the Minutemen in one sentence. And because the organization fears centralized authority, it never develops strong enforcement mechanisms capable of solving this problem. They cannot force settlements to contribute consistently without betraying their own ideological identity. The moment the Minutemen start demanding taxes or mandatory military service, they begin resembling the exact kind of authority structure they emotionally reject. So instead, they rely on goodwill. Again, always goodwill. The faction treats moral obligation as a substitute for institutional obligation. That works until people get scared. Then it falls apart immediately. The military structure is equally fragile, or honestly, barely a structure at all. The Minutemen are technically a militia network rather than a professional army. Members come and go. Training standards appear inconsistent or non-existent. Equipment quality varies enormously. Local groups operate semi-independently. Leadership authority fluctuates depending on personality rather than formalized systems. This creates massive operational weaknesses. Professional military organizations survive because they standardize behavior. Clear ranks, clear procedures, clear logistics, clear expectations. The Brotherhood of Steel can mobilize large coordinated operations because their hierarchy is rigid and institutionalized. Orders travel downward through stable chains of command. The Minutemen function more like armed neighborhood associations, trying to coordinate across a war zone, and the Commonwealth is far too dangerous for that model long term. Think about how exposed their settlements remain, even at peak strength. Most communities consist of scattered farms, defended by improvised barricades, and volunteers carrying mismatched weapons. Communication between settlements remains unreliable. Reinforcement times vary wildly. Travel itself remains dangerous because the Minutemen lack sufficient manpower to secure major transit routes consistently. This is not a civilization rebuilding itself. This is a civilization improvising constantly to delay collapse. And eventually, improvisation stops working. The lack of centralized logistics may actually be the faction's biggest hidden weakness. Wars are won through supply systems long before battles happen. Ammunition production, food transportation, medical distribution, equipment, maintenance, replacement personnel, fuel allocation, repair infrastructure. The Minutemen barely possess any coordinated logistical framework at all. Every settlement largely sustains itself independently, which sounds empowering until one settlement experiences crop failure, or a major attack, or disease, or resource depletion. Then suddenly, the entire regional network becomes unstable because there is no strong centralized reserve capacity, no massive agricultural surplus system, no industrial manufacturing base, no sophisticated transportation infrastructure. Everything remains local, small, fragmented, and fragmentation is death during large-scale crises. This is why the faction repeatedly struggles against more organized enemies, despite having broad public support. Public support is not enough. You need institutional depth. You need the ability to absorb losses without immediate systemic collapse. The Minutemen never achieve that resilience. Even their command structure feels strangely undefined. The title of general exists, but what actual powers accompany it? Can the general compel settlements to provide troops? Can they redistribute resources forcibly? Can they punish disobedience? Can they establish binding regional policy? The game never gives satisfying answers, because the faction itself seems uncertain. Authority inside the Minutemen exists in this awkward half-state where leadership relies heavily on persuasion rather than formal sovereignty, which sounds democratic and morally pure, but becomes disastrous under pressure. Because persuasion weakens dramatically during fear, and the Commonwealth runs on fear. Every settlement worries first about its own survival. That instinct constantly undermines broader cooperation. The Minutemen attempt to overcome this through shared ideals instead of enforceable systems. But shared ideals are psychologically fragile when people start starving or dying. This is why the organization collapses so quickly after repeated military setbacks. There is no deep institutional backbone stabilizing the faction underneath public morale. Once confidence erodes, participation erodes too. Settlements withdraw support. Volunteers disappear. Regional coordination fragments. A strong state survives panic. The Minutemen amplify it. Their technological weakness compounds everything further. Compared to factions like the Institute or Brotherhood, the Minutemen operate with astonishingly primitive capabilities. No major manufacturing infrastructure, limited advanced weapon production, weak communications technology, minimal research capacity, no large-scale energy systems. They essentially attempt to rebuild civilization while remaining technologically decentralized subsistence communities connected through militia patrols. That is an unbelievably difficult model to sustain against industrialized threats. And Fallout quietly demonstrates this constantly. The Brotherhood arrives in the Commonwealth and almost immediately projects force across huge distances, using vertibirds, power armor, advanced logistics, and military discipline. The Institute coordinates underground scientific operations with terrifying efficiency. Even the Gunners maintain more professional military organization in many areas. The Minutemen compensate for technological inferiority through moral legitimacy and local familiarity. But morality does not stop plasma fire, and local familiarity does not create industrial capacity. This is where the romantic mythology surrounding militias becomes dangerous. Popular culture often portrays decentralized citizen militias as inherently virtuous alternatives to centralized military systems. But historically, militias usually struggle badly against organized professional powers over long periods unless they evolve institutionally, because sustained stability requires administration, not just courage. The Minutemen possess courage everywhere, administration almost nowhere. Even the settlement network itself exposes deeper contradictions. Settlements want autonomy while simultaneously demanding regional security. They resist external control but expect collective defense. This creates constant tension between local independence and broader coordination. The Minutemen try balancing these competing desires indefinitely. Historically, balancing them indefinitely is almost impossible. Eventually, centralized authority either strengthens or the system fragments. The Commonwealth repeatedly trends toward fragmentation because the Minutemen hesitate to consolidate power structurally. And to be fair, their fear makes sense. Fallout's world is filled with authoritarian nightmares. The old world destroyed itself through militarism, corporate power, and political corruption. The Brotherhood hoards technology aggressively. The Institute manipulates humanity from underground. Caesar's Legion in the West builds civilization through slavery and terror. The Minutemen desperately want to avoid becoming another oppressive regime. That moral caution is understandable. But avoiding centralized authority entirely creates a different form of instability. Weak states often produce enormous human suffering too. That is one of Fallout's recurring themes, actually. Power is dangerous, but power vacuums are dangerous too. The Commonwealth, before the sole survivor, is effectively trapped between these extremes, too fragmented to stabilize itself organically, too suspicious of authority to build durable institutions willingly. The Minutemen embody this contradiction more than any faction in the game. They are trying to create civilization while remaining emotionally uncomfortable with the mechanisms civilization historically requires. And maybe the clearest proof of this failure is how dependent the entire faction becomes on personal charisma, not systems, people. General Becker temporarily stabilizes the organization through leadership presence. Preston attempts rebuilding through inspiration. The sole survivor practically carries the Commonwealth through sheer individual competence. Everything revolves around heroic personalities, compensating for weak institutions. This is unsustainable by definition. Strong societies do not require legendary individuals constantly preventing collapse. Systems themselves provide continuity. Leadership matters, but institutions matter more. The Minutemen never truly learn this lesson. Even after rebuilding begins in Fallout 4, the organization still behaves more like a reactive coalition than a coherent state. Settlements remain semi-independent. Regional planning remains vague. Resource distribution stays inconsistent. Security depends heavily on the player's direct intervention. The Commonwealth survives because the player functions like a superhuman administrative machine compensating for institutional weakness manually. But once you remove the player mentally from the equation, the same terrifying question always returns. Could this system actually survive on its own? And the honest answer increasingly feels like no, because structurally, the Minutemen are not really building a nation. They are building a temporary alliance held together by optimism, fear, and extraordinary individuals. That can work for a while, sometimes even for generations, but eventually reality arrives demanding stronger foundations. And the Commonwealth has already shown exactly what happens when those foundations are missing. The castle is probably the single most emotionally effective moment in the entire Minutemen storyline. You arrive at the ruins of an old coastal fort swallowed by time, covered in mirelurk nests and collapsed stone, and Preston speaks about it almost like a sacred place, not just a headquarters, not just a military position, a symbol, the old heart of the Minutemen, the place where the faction once stood strong before everything fell apart. And when the player retakes it, the game deliberately frames the moment like a rebirth. The walls are reclaimed, the radio comes back online, artillery cannons rise over the battlements, the Minutemen flag returns. For the first time since Quincy, it genuinely feels like maybe the Commonwealth is healing. But that feeling is also deeply misleading, because the castle represents almost everything the Minutemen consistently confuse throughout Fallout 4. Symbolism mistaken for structure, emotion mistaken for stability, hope mistaken for capability. The castle matters enormously to the faction psychologically, because the Minutemen are obsessed with historical memory. They constantly define themselves through what they represent, rather than what they materially are. Even the choice of headquarters reveals this mindset perfectly. The castle is not an efficient, modern military installation. It is a relic, a reconstructed memory of revolutionary America, a visual reminder of the colonial militias the Minutemen idolized so heavily. And honestly, that nostalgia is incredibly powerful. Fallout as a franchise is built around the ruins of American mythology. Everywhere you look, the old world survives through symbols. Flags hanging in abandoned buildings, patriotic propaganda posters still glowing centuries after nuclear war, pre-war music drifting through dead cities. The entire setting constantly asks whether people can separate the idealized image of America from the catastrophic reality that image helped create. The Minutemen never really separate those things at all. Instead, they embrace the mythology completely. The castle becomes their emotional anchor, because it allows them to imagine continuity with a heroic past. It tells settlers that the Commonwealth still belongs to ordinary people, willing to defend each other. It transforms the Minutemen from scattered survivors back into something that feels historically significant. But feelings are dangerous in Fallout because they often conceal structural weakness underneath. Retaking the castle creates the illusion that the Minutemen are becoming a real state again. Yet almost none of the underlying institutional problems are actually solved. This is what makes the entire sequence so fascinating. On the surface, the faction appears dramatically stronger afterward. They establish centralized communications through radio freedom. They coordinate artillery support. Settlements rally behind them again. Patrols expand. Civilians regain hope. And emotionally, that hope matters. But materially, what has truly changed? The Commonwealth is still fragmented. Settlements are still loosely connected. Supply lines remain fragile. Industrial production remains primitive. The Minutemen still rely heavily on volunteers. The entire organization still depends almost entirely on the sole survivor's leadership. The castle gives the appearance of statehood without fully achieving it, and appearances matter enormously in politics. That is actually one of the most realistic things about the Minutemen. Governments throughout history have relied heavily on symbolic architecture to project legitimacy. Capitals, fortresses, ceremonial buildings, national monuments. These structures create emotional cohesion. They convince populations that authority exists in durable physical form. The castle serves exactly this function. When settlers hear radio freedom broadcasting again, they do not just hear military communications. They hear reassurance. They hear continuity. They hear proof that somebody is still trying to hold civilization together. That psychological effect is real. but it also hides a terrifying fragility underneath. Because the Minutemen's strength after reclaiming the castle remains heavily performative. Take the artillery system, for example. Within gameplay, Minutemen artillery feels powerful. Entire groups of enemies can be obliterated through coordinated bombardment. The castle suddenly appears militarily formidable. Settlements linked to the artillery network feel interconnected for the first time. But if you think about the system logically, it reveals the same weaknesses haunting the faction everywhere else. Artillery requires logistics, ammunition production, maintenance, training, communication coordination, reliable supply routes. The Minutemen barely possess these capabilities on a large scale. Their artillery network works primarily because the player personally builds and maintains it through gameplay abstraction. Realistically, sustaining widespread artillery operations across the Commonwealth would require industrial infrastructure far beyond what the Minutemen visibly possess, which means the artillery functions more as psychological theatre than evidence of genuine military transformation. And again, theatre matters, probably more than people realize. Most civilians in the Commonwealth are not military analysts. They respond emotionally to displays of organization and strength. Hearing artillery fire across the wasteland communicates something important. It tells people the Minutemen are active again, that somebody can project force beyond isolated settlements, that maybe civilization is returning. The castle itself amplifies this message constantly. Every repaired wall, every flag, every guard patrol, every radio announcement contributes to a narrative of recovery. The Minutemen survive partly because they are extraordinarily good at embodying emotional reassurance. The problem is that reassurance and stability are not identical. This becomes especially obvious when you consider how vulnerable the castle actually remains, despite all the rebuilding. The headquarters sits exposed on the coast, partially ruined, dependent on limited manpower spread across an enormous hostile region. A determined large-scale military assault could still threaten it severely. And if the castle falls again, what happens psychologically? That question matters because the Minutemen rely heavily on symbolic victories to sustain morale. Their entire identity is intertwined with emotional momentum. When hope rises, the faction expands rapidly. When hope collapses, participation evaporates. That is an incredibly unstable foundation for civilization. Strong states survive disappointment. The Minutemen barely survive discouragement. You can see this dynamic clearly in how radio freedom operates. The broadcasts constantly emphasize optimism, cooperation, and resilience. Settlements needing help, patrols securing roads, citizens encouraged to support rebuilding efforts. It sounds uplifting. It also sounds desperate, because beneath every broadcast is the implicit recognition that the Commonwealth still remains deeply unstable. Raiders continue attacking settlements constantly. Super mutants still roam freely. Entire regions remain dangerous. The Minutemen celebrate every tiny victory because the broader strategic situation never truly stops being precarious. The radio does not broadcast from a position of overwhelming strength. It broadcasts from a position of permanent maintenance. And maybe that is the hidden tragedy of the castle itself. The Minutemen treat reclaiming it like the restoration of civilization. In reality, it is the restoration of morale. Those are not the same thing. Morale can inspire people temporarily. It can motivate cooperation. It can sustain communities through difficult periods. But morale alone cannot replace institutional depth indefinitely. Eventually, systems matter more than emotions. The castle never fully becomes the administrative center of a functioning nation because the Minutemen never fully become a functioning nation. They become a symbolic alliance network held together through shared belief and charismatic leadership. Again, always belief, always leadership, never enough structure. And honestly, the game subtly understands this, even while celebrating the faction emotionally. The Commonwealth, after reclaiming the castle, still feels unstable in nearly every meaningful sense. Settlements remain vulnerable, infrastructure barely improves visibly, trade routes stay dangerous, violence continues everywhere. The castle creates the sensation of progress more than the reality of transformation. That sounds cynical, but look carefully at what the Minutemen actually accomplish materially after rebuilding begins. They improve local defense capacity. They coordinate settlements somewhat more effectively. They reduce immediate suffering in many regions. All of that is valuable, but it is not the same thing as rebuilding civilization. Civilization requires durable institutions capable of surviving leadership transitions, military setbacks, economic disruption, and internal conflict. The castle does not solve these problems. It simply provides the emotional illusion that they are being solved, which is why the Minutemen become so dependent on symbolic storytelling. The faction constantly frames itself as the return of something ancient and righteous. Ordinary people standing together, citizens defending neighbors, the spirit of old America reborn after apocalypse. These narratives create emotional cohesion in the absence of stronger administrative cohesion. And honestly, humans do need narratives. Societies cannot survive on logistics alone. People need meaning too. They need stories explaining why sacrifice matters, why cooperation matters, why survival matters. The Minutemen provide that story better than almost any faction in Fallout. But stories alone cannot stabilize regions permanently. At some point, material reality pushes back, and the Commonwealth's material reality remains horrifying. The farms are fragile, industry barely exists, medicine remains limited, transportation, infrastructure is shattered, mutant threats persist everywhere, political authority remains vague. The castle does not fundamentally resolve any of this. It simply gives people something beautiful to believe in while those problems continue. There is also something deeply revealing about how quickly the Minutemen gravitate towards symbols compared to systems. The moment the castle is retaken, enormous emotional emphasis gets placed on appearances, rebuilding walls, raising flags, broadcasting triumphant messages, establishing ceremonial authority. Again, this is realistic. Emerging governments often rely heavily on symbolic displays because legitimacy itself becomes a form of power. But the imbalance matters. The Minutemen consistently prioritize the emotional experience of rebuilding over the administrative realities of rebuilding. That is why the castle feels simultaneously inspiring and hollow. It is civilization as performance. And maybe that performance is necessary in a world like Fallout. Maybe exhausted people need myths before they can build institutions. Maybe emotional hope really must come first. But the danger is obvious. If the symbols start failing, the entire structure risks collapsing with them. The old Minutemen already proved this once. When Quincy fell, the organization did not merely lose soldiers, it lost legitimacy. And because so much of the faction depended on emotional legitimacy instead of durable institutional authority, the collapse spread incredibly fast. The rebuilt Minutemen still carry that vulnerability inside them. Everything feels stable as long as victories continue. But what happens after the next major disaster? What happens after a failed campaign? A famine? A leadership crisis? The death of the sole survivor? The castle does not answer these questions. It distracts from them, and perhaps that is why the location feels so haunting beneath all the triumphant music and hopeful dialogue. Deep down, the player understands instinctively that the Minutemen are trying to rebuild an entire civilization through emotional symbolism because they lack the capacity to rebuild it through overwhelming structural power. The castle is not evidence the Commonwealth has healed. It is evidence the Commonwealth desperately wants to believe healing is possible. And those are very different things. The Brotherhood of Steel arrives in the Commonwealth like an empire descending from the sky. The Institute operates beneath the earth like an invisible civilization centuries ahead of everyone else. The railroad hides within the shadows like an underground resistance movement surviving through secrecy and paranoia. And then there are the Minutemen, farmers with laser muskets trying to hold the world together through optimism. When players discuss Fallout 4's factions morally, the Minutemen usually win almost automatically. They are compassionate, they help ordinary people, they avoid obvious authoritarianism. Compared to organizations conducting kidnappings or hoarding technology behind military dogma, the Minutemen seem refreshingly humane, and morally, that instinct makes sense. But morality alone does not determine whether a civilization survives. That is where the comparison becomes uncomfortable, because once you stop asking which faction is nicest and start asking which faction is most capable of rebuilding a stable society, the Minutemen suddenly look much weaker. The Brotherhood of Steel is probably the clearest example of this contrast. The Brotherhood is deeply flawed, authoritarian, militaristic, technologically elitist, suspicious of outsiders, often arrogant to the point of cruelty. Their ideology consistently prioritizes technological control over democratic freedom. They project power aggressively and expect obedience from surrounding populations. And yet they function. That is the part people sometimes avoid admitting. The Brotherhood possesses discipline, logistics, manufacturing capability, military doctrine, communication systems, clear hierarchy, and ideological cohesion. They can mobilize large numbers of trained personnel rapidly across hostile territory. They maintain advanced equipment over long periods. They survive catastrophic losses because the institution itself possesses structural depth. Even their arrival in Fallout 4 demonstrates this brutally. The Prydwen enters the Commonwealth and immediately changes the regional balance of power. Vertibirds patrol the skies. Power-armored soldiers establish checkpoints. Large military operations begin almost instantly. Whether people like the Brotherhood or not becomes almost irrelevant in the face of their organizational capability. The Minutemen simply cannot project force on that scale, not even close. And that matters because the Commonwealth is not merely dangerous, it is systemically unstable. Raiders, supermutants, feral ghouls, mercenaries, synth infiltration, food insecurity, infrastructure collapse. This environment rewards factions capable of centralized coordination and rapid military response. The Brotherhood thrives under those conditions. The Minutemen struggle constantly. This creates one of the central, uncomfortable truths of Fallout. Authoritarian organizations often outperform decentralized, idealistic ones during periods of severe instability. Not because authoritarianism is morally superior, but because centralized command structures solve coordination problems more efficiently under pressure. The Brotherhood can issue orders and expect compliance. The Minutemen negotiate constantly with semi-independent settlements. That difference becomes enormous during crisis situations. Imagine large-scale regional famine hitting the Commonwealth. The Brotherhood could theoretically centralize food distribution through military enforcement. Harshly, probably unfairly, but effectively enough to maintain order temporarily. The Minutemen would face endless negotiation between autonomous settlements, prioritizing local survival. And again, morally, the Minutemen approach feels more humane. Practically, it may be less survivable. That tension defines almost every comparison between the factions. The Institute represents a completely different version of capability. Where the Brotherhood relies on military hierarchy, the Institute relies on technological supremacy, underground agriculture, synthetic labor, teleportation, advanced medicine, robotics, energy production, scientific coordination. Compared to the Commonwealth surface, the Institute essentially functions like a post-apocalyptic civilization. And yes, morally they are horrifying. Kidnappings, human experimentation, replacement synths, social isolation, complete detachment from surface suffering. The Institute repeatedly treats humanity like a laboratory population rather than a society deserving dignity. But structurally, they are extraordinarily successful. That is the nightmare of the Institute. They embody competence without compassion. Everything works. Their systems endure for generations. Scientific progress continues. Infrastructure remains functional. Leadership transitions occur without societal collapse. The Minutemen are almost the inverse: compassion without competence, or at least compassion without enough competence to stabilize civilization sustainably. And Fallout intentionally forces players to sit with this discomfort, because the Commonwealth's nicest faction is also arguably the least prepared to solve civilization-scale problems long-term. The Institute could probably rebuild the region materially if it genuinely wanted to. The Brotherhood could impose order militarily if it fully committed. The Minutemen mostly reduce suffering locally, while hoping broader stability emerges gradually through goodwill. One approach is morally monstrous, but structurally effective. The other is morally admirable, but structurally fragile. And Fallout refuses to provide clean answers about which failure is worse. Even the Railroad exposes weaknesses inside the Minutemen, despite being far smaller organizationally. The Railroad is hyper-focused. That focus matters enormously. They possess a clear mission, operational secrecy, compartmentalized cells, intelligence gathering capability, and dedicated personnel willing to sacrifice everything for a specific cause. Now, obviously, the Railroad could never govern the Commonwealth directly. Their organization is too specialized and covert for that. But compared to the Minutemen, they actually understand their limitations much more clearly. The Railroad does not pretend to be rebuilding civilization broadly. The Minutemen do, and that difference creates enormous strategic overextension. The Minutemen attempt to protect everyone, everywhere, all at once. Farms, trade routes, settlements, civilians, regional defense, political legitimacy, infrastructure support, raider suppression, community coordination. It is an impossible mandate for an organization with such weak institutional foundations. The Railroad survives partly because it limits its objectives carefully. The Brotherhood survives because it centralizes authority aggressively. The Institute survives because it controls advanced technology comprehensively. The Minutemen survive through emotional legitimacy, which is probably the least reliable foundation of all. And maybe the most painful comparison is this: the Minutemen only really become viable after every other major faction weakens each other first. Think about the actual structure of the Minutemen ending. The Brotherhood can be destroyed or heavily diminished. The Institute is eliminated. The Railroad either cooperates quietly or becomes strategically irrelevant. By the end, the Minutemen inherit a commonwealth where stronger centralized competitors have already been neutralized. That is incredibly important, because it suggests the Minutemen are not strong enough to dominate the political landscape independently. They become successful partly because nobody else remains capable of contesting regional influence effectively. And even then, their control feels loose and incomplete. Raiders still exist. Mutants still exist. Settlements still remain semi-autonomous. The Commonwealth still feels dangerous. The Minutemen victory is less a decisive transformation and more a reduction in overall suffering, which is meaningful but limited. This is where the argument becomes emotionally difficult, because the Minutemen genuinely are the least malicious faction overall. They do not seek domination for domination's sake. They do not intentionally exploit civilians systematically. Their goals are fundamentally humane, but history does not reward good intentions automatically. Civilizations survive through combinations of morality and organizational strength. The Minutemen possess one far more than the other, and maybe that is why players instinctively defend them so fiercely. Supporting the Minutemen feels emotionally comforting because it preserves the belief that decency itself should be enough, that ordinary people, cooperating voluntarily, should eventually outperform militarists, technocrats, and extremists. We want that to be true. Fallout repeatedly implies it might not be. The Brotherhood can enforce regional security in ways the Minutemen cannot. The Institute can coordinate resources in ways the Minutemen cannot. Even the Railroad can maintain operational discipline in ways the Minutemen struggle to achieve. The Minutemen compensate through moral legitimacy and popular support, but popular support becomes unstable when material conditions fail to improve fast enough. And the Commonwealth's problems are enormous. 2 centuries after nuclear war, basic infrastructure barely exists. Roads remain deadly. Food insecurity persists constantly. Entire regions are controlled by hostile groups. Disease and violence remain normalized. The Minutemen address symptoms effectively in many cases, but their ability to transform systemic conditions remains uncertain at best. That is the hidden fear lurking underneath the faction's optimism. What if the Minutemen are good enough to inspire hope, but not powerful enough to secure the future that hope requires? Because hope creates expectations, and failed expectations can destroy societies faster than hopelessness sometimes. The original collapse after Quincy already demonstrated this. People trusted the Minutemen emotionally. When the organization failed catastrophically, public faith shattered alongside it. The Commonwealth became more fragmented afterward because belief in collective security collapsed. The rebuilt Minutemen still carry this risk. If they fail again, what happens psychologically to the Commonwealth then? Would people even try believing a third time? And perhaps the darkest possibility is that the Minutemen only appear superior because their failures feel morally gentler than everyone else's. The Brotherhood risks oppression. The Institute risks dehumanization. The Railroad risks irrelevance. The Minutemen risk collapse. And collapse can kill just as many people eventually, maybe more, because weak protection in a wasteland often means no protection at all. That does not make the Minutemen evil, but it may make them tragically insufficient, which is honestly more disturbing. The Minutemen ending in Fallout 4 feels triumphant the first time you experience it. The castle stands restored, settlements cooperate again, the Institute is destroyed, radio freedom broadcasts across the Commonwealth, Preston speaks about rebuilding a better future, and emotionally, the entire sequence is designed to feel hopeful. After so much violence and paranoia and collapse, the player finally helps ordinary people stand together again. The Commonwealth survives without falling completely under military dictatorship or scientific manipulation. It feels humane, it feels optimistic, it feels like the good ending. But when you look carefully at what actually changes structurally, the entire victory becomes strangely ambiguous, because the Minutemen ending does not really show civilization rebuilt. It shows civilization surviving. Those are very different things. The destruction of the Institute removes one of the Commonwealth's largest hidden threats. No more synth replacement operations. No more secret experiments manipulating surface communities. No more underground technocracy operating beyond accountability. That absolutely matters. But destroying the Institute also eliminates one of the only highly advanced industrial and scientific infrastructures remaining in the region. The Minutemen inherit the Commonwealth without inheriting most of the systems capable of rapidly modernizing it. That creates a strange contradiction. The morally safest ending may also be the materially weakest ending long-term. And Fallout 4 deliberately avoids resolving this tension clearly. After the Institute falls, the Commonwealth still looks remarkably unstable. Raiders continue operating. Super mutants still roam urban ruins. Trade routes remain dangerous. Settlements still require constant protection. Infrastructure remains primitive. Agriculture stays fragile. The wasteland does not suddenly transform into a functioning nation-state. Instead, the player creates a loose defensive alliance network, reducing immediate suffering incrementally. Again, that matters. But it is not the same thing as rebuilding civilization. This becomes especially obvious when you compare the Minutemen ending to what actual post-collapse recovery would realistically require. Large-scale manufacturing, regional governance, coordinated law enforcement, medical systems, education infrastructure, resource standardization, population integration, economic stabilization. The Minutemen barely approach most of these challenges directly. Instead, the ending focuses heavily on emotional symbolism, communities cooperating, citizens helping each other, freedom preserved against tyranny, the restoration of hope, and emotionally, those themes are beautiful. But structurally, the Commonwealth still feels alarmingly fragile afterward. One reason for this is that the Minutemen never fully transition from militia to government. They remain primarily a defensive volunteer network, coordinating settlements rather than a centralized administrative authority. The sole survivor becomes general, but what exactly does that mean politically? Do settlements now answer to a Commonwealth government? Are there laws, taxes, courts, unified economic systems? The game stays vague because the faction itself remains vague. And maybe that vagueness is intentional. Bethesda clearly wants the Minutemen ending to feel morally open and player-driven. The Commonwealth belongs to the people, rather than a rigid ideological structure. Players can imagine whatever future they prefer afterward, but analytically, that ambiguity creates serious concerns. Because decentralized alliances historically struggle badly with long-term coordination once the unifying crisis disappears. The Minutemen are strongest during immediate emergencies, defending settlements, repelling attacks, coordinating survival. But governing peacetime societies requires completely different institutional capacities. The ending never convincingly demonstrates those capacities emerging. Instead, it relies heavily on the emotional assumption that cooperation itself will gradually solve deeper structural problems over time, and maybe it will. But Fallout gives us very little concrete evidence supporting that optimism. Even after victory, the Commonwealth still depends enormously on the sole survivor personally. The player remains the connective tissue holding everything together. Settlement networks, defense systems, resource sharing, infrastructure building, diplomacy. Nearly all major progress flows through one central, heroic figure. That is not institutional stability. That is personalized stability. And personalized stability becomes dangerous the moment the central individual disappears. What happens when the sole survivor dies? The game never asks this directly because the fantasy depends on avoiding the question. But realistically, it matters more than almost anything else. Strong civilizations survive leadership transitions routinely. Weak civilizations collapse into chaos whenever exceptional individuals vanish. The Minutemen already experienced this once after General Becker. Nothing in the ending guarantees the pattern will not repeat, especially because many underlying conditions remain unchanged. The Commonwealth is still geographically fragmented. Settlements still maintain strong local identities. Threats still exist everywhere. Resources remain limited. Communication infrastructure stays primitive compared to modern societies. The Minutemen achieve stabilization, not transformation, and stabilization can be temporary. This is why the ending sometimes feels strangely small, despite its emotional weight. The player defeats major enemies, but the broader world still feels trapped in survival mode. You can build prosperous settlements manually through gameplay mechanics, but narratively, the Commonwealth never truly evolves into something unmistakably post-apocalyptic. The wasteland survives. It does not fully heal, and perhaps that is realistic. Maybe no faction could realistically rebuild civilization quickly after 2 centuries of collapse. Maybe the Minutemen deserve enormous credit simply for reducing suffering and restoring partial regional cooperation. That is a fair argument, but it also quietly lowers the scale of what the faction actually accomplishes compared to their rhetoric about rebuilding the Commonwealth. Because rebuilding implies durable, systemic recovery, the Minutemen mostly achieve decentralized resilience. Again, valuable, again, limited. There is also something revealing about how the ending handles political authority. The Minutemen avoid imposing strong centralized control, partly because players associate freedom with moral legitimacy. The Commonwealth remains locally autonomous. Settlements cooperate voluntarily. No oppressive regime emerges. Emotionally satisfying, but politically unstable. Voluntary alliances function best when resources are abundant and threats are manageable. The Commonwealth has neither condition. Scarcity and danger constantly pressure communities toward fragmentation. The Minutemen depend heavily on goodwill, continuing indefinitely despite these pressures. History suggests that is difficult, especially after the central wartime hero eventually disappears. The game avoids showing long-term consequences because long-term consequences might complicate the hopeful emotional tone. What happens 50 years later, 100 years later? Does the Commonwealth eventually centralize into a stronger government? Does the Minutemen network fracture again? Do regional warlords emerge? Does another Quincy happen? We do not know. And maybe Bethesda intentionally leaves the answer uncertain because uncertainty itself fits Fallout's worldview. No faction fully solves history. No ideology permanently secures humanity against collapse. Every attempt at rebuilding carries flaws capable of becoming future catastrophes. The Minutemen simply embody a gentler version of this cycle, which honestly makes them more tragic than evil. Because, unlike the Brotherhood or Institute, the Minutemen genuinely want ordinary people to remain free. Their ending preserves human dignity better than most alternatives. Communities retain autonomy. Civilians avoid mass oppression. Cooperation replaces domination wherever possible. Morally, that is meaningful. But morally meaningful outcomes are not always historically durable outcomes. And the Commonwealth remains a terrifying environment for fragile political systems. Raiders still recruit from desperate populations. Mutants still threaten trade and settlement expansion. Technology remains inconsistent. Infrastructure remains damaged. Medical care stays limited. The Minutemen reduce chaos without fully overcoming the conditions generating chaos continuously. That distinction matters enormously. The ending essentially creates a Commonwealth capable of surviving day by day through cooperation rather than transforming into a highly organized civilization capable of reshaping regional conditions fundamentally. Maybe that is enough. Maybe after Fallout's endless cycles of authoritarianism and violence, survival with dignity truly is the best humanity can realistically hope for. But if that is true, then the Minutemen are not really rebuilding civilization. They are managing decline compassionately. And that is a much sadder interpretation of the ending than most players initially realize. Because beneath the hopeful speeches and restored flags lies a difficult possibility. The Minutemen may not represent humanity overcoming collapse. They may represent humanity learning how to live inside collapse more humanely without ever truly escaping it. And maybe the clearest sign of this limitation is how strangely static the Commonwealth still feels after the Minutemen victory. Think about it carefully. The Institute ending implies enormous technological transformation. The Brotherhood ending implies military occupation and centralized order. Even the Railroad ending suggests a major underground liberation movement reshaping political tensions across the region. But the Minutemen ending feels intentionally smaller in scale, more intimate, more local. The player helps people survive. The player protects communities. The player creates pockets of safety. But the Commonwealth itself never truly stops looking like the Commonwealth. Ruined highways still dominate the landscape. Collapsed buildings still rot across Boston. Settlements remain tiny and improvised. Most people still live one bad harvest away from disaster. The world remains visibly post-apocalyptic in almost every meaningful sense. That visual continuity is important because Fallout 4 quietly communicates something uncomfortable through environmental storytelling. The Minutemen stabilize collapse. They do not reverse it, and perhaps the faction understands this subconsciously, even if Preston never fully says it aloud. The Minutemen rarely speak in terms of massive transformation. Their language revolves around protection, safety, helping people, keeping hope alive, defending settlements. The scale of ambition itself becomes smaller, not conquering the wasteland, not industrializing the Commonwealth, not creating a new technological civilization, just helping people survive with some measure of dignity. Again, morally admirable, but it also reveals how limited the faction's actual capabilities are compared to the magnitude of the Commonwealth's problems. This is why the settlement system feels simultaneously empowering and strangely depressing over long playthroughs. You can build walls, turrets, farms, generators, water purifiers, entire small communities, but everything still feels fragile, temporary, vulnerable, like the world could unravel again at any moment, because, structurally, it probably could. The Minutemen network depends heavily on constant maintenance, constant patrols, constant intervention, constant crisis management. Raiders never stop attacking because the underlying conditions producing raiders never disappear. Poverty remains everywhere. Isolation remains everywhere. Scarcity remains everywhere. The faction treats violence symptomatically rather than systemically. Clear the raiders from one outpost, and another gang eventually forms somewhere else. Defend one settlement, and another comes under attack. Secure one trade route, and another becomes dangerous. The Commonwealth operates like a leaking ship, constantly taking on water faster than repairs can permanently stabilize it. And the Minutemen respond by running from leak to leak with buckets. Heroically, endlessly, maybe hopelessly. This endless cycle becomes especially noticeable once the emotional momentum of the main storyline fades. After the Institute is gone and the dramatic battles end, what remains? More settlement defense, more patrol coordination, more local emergencies. The Minutemen experience almost no real transition from wartime mobilization into peacetime governance, because the Commonwealth never fully enters peacetime at all. The crisis simply becomes normalized. A normalized crisis changes societies in dangerous ways. Communities trapped in permanent instability struggle to develop long-term institutions because survival always feels more urgent than planning. Everything becomes reactive, short-term, improvised. That mindset permeates the entire Minutemen structure. Even after victory, the faction still behaves like a resistance movement rather than a mature government, which raises another uncomfortable question. Would the Minutemen even know how to govern effectively if the Commonwealth finally stabilized? Because leadership during emergencies and leadership during stability require very different skills. Military coordination is not the same thing as economic planning. Protecting settlements is not the same thing as administering regions. Inspiring hope is not the same thing as building durable institutions. The Minutemen excel emotionally during crisis because their ideology is rooted in mutual aid and community defense. But once you move beyond immediate survival concerns, their lack of broader political structure becomes glaring. Who regulates trade disputes between settlements? Who manages regional infrastructure projects? Who standardizes laws? Who resolves territorial conflicts? Who coordinates industrial development? The ending leaves these questions floating unanswered because the faction itself barely addresses them conceptually. And honestly, that avoidance might reflect a deeper fear inside the Minutemen philosophy itself. The fear that becoming truly effective might require becoming less morally comfortable. Because large-scale governance almost always involves coercion eventually. Taxes, enforcement, resource allocation, legal authority, mandatory obligations, bureaucracy. All the messy systems the Minutemen instinctively associate with the corruption and oppression of the old world. So instead, they remain emotionally attached to localized volunteerism. And volunteerism feels noble, precisely because participation appears consensual. But civilizations built entirely on voluntary sacrifice tend to become unstable once enthusiasm declines. That is the shadow hanging over the Minutemen, ending constantly. Everything works as long as people continue believing, as long as settlements cooperate, as long as volunteers show up, as long as the sole survivor remains active, as long as morale stays high, as long as major disasters do not overwhelm the system again. There are too many conditions. Strong states survive even when people lose faith temporarily. The Minutemen require faith continuously. That dependency makes the faction feel less like a stable civilization and more like a permanent social movement. Movements can inspire extraordinary action for limited periods of time. They can mobilize communities emotionally. They can resist oppression. They can survive crises, but movements often struggle transitioning into durable governing systems because governing requires routine, administration, predictability, compromise, bureaucratic continuity. The Minutemen thrive through emotional energy rather than bureaucratic stability, and emotional energy burns out eventually. Even the rank structure reveals this weakness. The title of general sounds impressive, but the actual governing apparatus surrounding the position remains astonishingly thin. No Senate, no administrative ministries, no formalized judiciary, no clear constitutional framework. Leadership authority exists almost entirely through personal legitimacy rather than institutional design, which means succession becomes terrifyingly uncertain. Again, always the same problem. What happens after the hero disappears? The game never answers, because answering honestly might unravel the optimism sustaining the entire faction fantasy. If the Commonwealth's future depends permanently on exceptional individuals holding everything together manually, then the Minutemen have not really solved civilization's collapse. They have delayed it, compassionately, and perhaps that is enough for some people. Maybe in Fallout's world, reducing suffering itself counts as victory even without true reconstruction. Maybe preserving freedom and human dignity matters more than building powerful centralized states capable of long-term transformation. That is probably the strongest moral defense of the Minutemen ending honestly. The faction avoids repeating the authoritarian patterns haunting nearly every other attempt at rebuilding civilization in Fallout. They refuse empire, refuse technocratic domination, refuse militarized oppression. They preserve the humanity of ordinary people instead of sacrificing it for efficiency. But the cost of that moral restraint may be permanent fragility. And Fallout quietly understands this trade-off everywhere. You can hear it in the exhaustion of settlers constantly begging for help. You can see it in the tiny improvised farms barely surviving among ruins centuries after the war. You can feel it in how temporary every victory seems. The Minutemen ending creates a commonwealth that feels kinder, not necessarily stronger, and maybe that distinction is the entire point. Because the faction ultimately represents a refusal to surrender morally, even when material victory seems impossible. They are not trying to dominate history through overwhelming force. They are trying to preserve human decency inside history's collapse. That is beautiful. It may also be insufficient, which is what makes the Minutemen so tragic compared to Fallout's other factions. The Brotherhood risks becoming oppressive because it is strong. The Institute becomes monstrous because it is advanced. The Minutemen risk failing precisely because they refuse to abandon their humanity completely. And maybe Fallout is asking whether that humanity can actually survive the wasteland long-term without transforming into something harder, harsher, and more centralized eventually. The game never gives a definitive answer, but the Commonwealth itself feels like an argument. Because even after all your victories, all your rebuilding, all your settlement networks and artillery batteries and hopeful radio broadcasts, the world still feels frighteningly close to collapse. Not doomed, not hopeless, just fragile, always fragile. And fragility is dangerous in a universe where history keeps punishing weak systems mercilessly. That is why the Minutemen ending lingers emotionally long after the credits. Not because it solves Fallout's central questions, but because it refuses to solve them cleanly. The player walks away feeling hopeful and uneasy simultaneously. Civilization survives, but barely. Freedom survives, but precariously. Humanity survives, but exhausted. The Commonwealth does not become a shining new republic rising from the ashes. It becomes a wounded collection of communities trying very hard not to fall apart again. And perhaps the saddest possibility of all is that this outcome may genuinely be the best the Minutemen are capable of achieving. Not because they lack courage, not because they lack compassion, because structurally they may never have been built for anything larger than survival in the first place. The reason the Minutemen feel so emotionally comfortable compared to every other faction in Fallout is not an accident. It is psychological design. Human beings are wired to trust narratives that mirror their own moral instincts. When we see people helping each other, we assume competence will eventually follow. When we see cooperation, we assume structure will naturally emerge. When we see kindness, we assume sustainability must be possible if only enough people participate. The Minutemen exploit that assumption without ever explicitly stating it. They present themselves as proof that decency can scale, that ordinary people, given enough motivation, can rebuild civilization without needing authoritarian control, technological domination, or militarized hierarchy. And that idea feels deeply satisfying because it aligns with how most players want the world to work. In real life, people rarely want to believe that stability requires coercion. The idea that governments need enforcement mechanisms, taxation systems, centralized logistics, and sometimes harsh decision-making feels uncomfortable. It clashes with the moral instinct that freedom and goodness should naturally align. The Minutemen exist precisely in that emotional gap. They are the embodiment of moral intuition overriding structural realism, and Fallout is constantly testing whether that intuition holds up under pressure. Because the Commonwealth is not a neutral environment, it is a collapsed ecosystem. Every system is degraded, every resource is contested, every settlement exists under threat. In that environment, moral clarity becomes much harder to translate into functional governance. The Minutemen say, help people because it is right, but the wasteland constantly asks, help people how, for how long, and with what sustained infrastructure. This is where the philosophy of niceness becomes complicated. Niceness, in the Minutemen sense, is not just politeness or kindness. It is a governing philosophy built around voluntary cooperation, emotional goodwill, and decentralized responsibility. It assumes that if people are treated fairly and shown compassion, they will naturally contribute to collective stability. In small communities, that can work surprisingly well. Humans are capable of extraordinary mutual aid in close-knit environments where trust is high and needs are visible. But scaling that behavior to an entire post-apocalyptic region introduces exponential complexity. The more people involved, the more incentives diverge. The more settlements exist, the more priorities conflict. The more territory expands, the more coordination costs rise. The Minutemen attempt to solve all of this through shared moral identity instead of enforceable structure. And shared identity is fragile when survival is uncertain, because morality competes with fear, and fear usually wins in unstable environments. Fallout repeatedly demonstrates this through environmental storytelling. Settlers hesitate to travel, traders avoid certain routes, communities barricade themselves. People remember past betrayals more vividly than past cooperation. Even when the Minutemen succeed locally, the broader psychological climate of the Commonwealth remains deeply cautious. That caution slowly erodes the foundation of voluntary cooperation, not because people are selfish in a simplistic sense, but because they are rationally prioritizing survival in a world where trust has repeatedly been punished. The Minutemen philosophy assumes that goodness is self-reinforcing. The Commonwealth suggests that goodness must be protected by structure, or it collapses under pressure. This is where Preston Garvey becomes central again, because he is not just a character, he is the living expression of that philosophy. Preston's worldview is fundamentally moral rather than institutional. He understands suffering immediately and emotionally. He reacts to crises with urgency and compassion, but he rarely translates those reactions into systemic analysis. When a settlement is attacked, his solution is always the same: send help, restore safety, move on to the next crisis. There is no deeper structural interrogation of why the attack happened, how to prevent future attacks systemically, or what regional reforms might reduce vulnerability across multiple settlements simultaneously. And this is not a personal flaw in intelligence. It is a reflection of lived experience. Preston grew up inside collapse. His entire understanding of leadership is shaped by constant emergency response. In his world, there is always another crisis waiting. Planning beyond the immediate threat feels almost unrealistic because the immediate threat never truly disappears. So he builds a philosophy of perpetual intervention. Help now, fix now, save now. And while that saves lives in the short term, it never accumulates into lasting systemic change. Because systems require accumulation, the Minutemen ending exposes this tension more clearly than any other faction outcome in Fallout 4. On the surface, it is framed as a victory of morality. The Institute is destroyed. The Commonwealth is freed from synth manipulation. Settlements cooperate again under Minutemen protection. The player becomes general and restores order across the region. But if you examine what actually changes structurally, the transformation is far less complete than it initially appears. The Minutemen do not replace the Institute with a functioning government. They replace it with a defensive network. That distinction is critical. A government builds systems of production, law, economy, and long-term governance. A defensive network reacts to threats. One constructs civilization, the other preserves survival. This is why the Minutemen ending feels emotionally satisfying, but analytically incomplete. It resolves immediate, existential threats, but does not fully resolve the underlying conditions that created those threats in the first place. The Commonwealth remains fractured. Settlements remain isolated. Infrastructure remains weak. Trade remains dangerous. Economic systems remain primitive. The Minutemen simply make this environment more survivable, not fundamentally different. That is the philosophical ceiling of the faction. They are not designed to transcend collapse. They are designed to mitigate it. And that limitation becomes especially obvious when comparing them to other factions in Fallout 4, because each alternative represents a different model of post-war recovery. The Brotherhood of Steel is the clearest contrast in terms of structural power. They are authoritarian, hierarchical, and ideologically rigid. They enforce discipline through command structure and technological superiority. Their society is not built around voluntary cooperation, but enforced cohesion. And while that makes them morally controversial, it also makes them operationally stable. The Brotherhood can mobilize quickly. They can maintain supply chains across long distances. They can sustain military campaigns over time. They can replace losses without organizational collapse. Their strength comes from eliminating ambiguity in decision-making. Orders are given, orders are followed, systems are maintained through hierarchy. This is the exact opposite of the Minutemen model. Where the Minutemen rely on persuasion and voluntary action, the Brotherhood relies on enforcement and command authority. And in a chaotic environment like the Commonwealth, that difference becomes decisive in many scenarios. Because chaos rewards coordination more than it rewards moral legitimacy, the Institute represents another form of stability entirely, rooted not in military hierarchy but technological control. Their underground civilization is one of the most advanced surviving human systems in the Fallout universe. They possess robotics, synthetic labor, teleportation, and advanced scientific infrastructure that far exceeds surface-level capabilities. From a purely structural perspective, they are the closest thing to a functioning post-scarcity society in the region. But their stability comes at the cost of extreme moral detachment. They isolate themselves from surface suffering. They treat humans as experimental subjects. They prioritize scientific progress over ethical responsibility. Their efficiency is undeniable. Their humanity is deeply compromised. This creates one of Fallout's core moral tensions. Competence does not guarantee morality, and morality does not guarantee competence. The Minutemen sit awkwardly between these extremes, lacking both the technological superiority of the Institute and the military discipline of the Brotherhood, which is why they feel so fragile in comparison. The Railroad adds another layer to this comparison, even though they are not designed to govern at all. The Railroad is a highly specialized resistance movement focused on freeing synths from Institute control. Their structure is decentralized but compartmentalized, allowing them to survive in hostile conditions through secrecy and operational discipline. Unlike the Minutemen, they understand their limitations clearly. They are not trying to rebuild civilization broadly. They are pursuing a narrow ideological goal with focused methodology. This clarity of purpose gives them a strange kind of resilience. They do less, but they do it with precision. The Minutemen, by contrast, attempt to do everything, protect every settlement, respond to every crisis, support every community, rebuild civilization as a whole. And that level of ambition without corresponding institutional depth creates systemic overextension. The Commonwealth becomes too large for their actual capacity, which forces constant reliance on the sole survivor to bridge gaps in coordination, which brings the comparison full circle back to the player dependency problem. Because in practice, all of these faction differences become less abstract and more immediate when you realize how much of the Minutemen's effectiveness is artificially sustained through player intervention. The sole survivor becomes the logistical backbone of the entire system. Every settlement secured, every supply line established, every major threat resolved, every expansion coordinated. Without the player, the Minutemen revert quickly toward fragmentation. And that reveals something essential about their ending. The Minutemen victory is not the emergence of a self-sustaining civilization. It is the temporary stabilization of a region through extraordinary individual intervention, which raises the most uncomfortable question of all. If a system only works when a godlike individual is actively maintaining it, is it actually a system at all, or just a simulation of one held together by exceptional circumstance? This is why the Minutemen ending feels so emotionally conflicted, even when it is framed as the good ending. It satisfies moral instincts while quietly undermining confidence in structural stability. The Commonwealth is safer, but not safe, cooperative, but not unified, hopeful, but still fragile. And that fragility becomes more obvious the longer you imagine life continuing after the main story ends. Because eventually, the sole survivor is gone. And when that happens, the entire network of settlements and alliances is left without its central coordinating force. The Minutemen do not clearly demonstrate a mechanism for surviving that transition. There is no institutional successor system, no strong bureaucratic continuity, no guaranteed leadership pipeline, no deeply entrenched administrative structure capable of absorbing the loss of a key figure without systemic disruption, which means the Commonwealth remains dependent on a temporary configuration of circumstances rather than a permanent transformation. And Fallout quietly leaves that implication hanging in the background of its most optimistic ending. The Minutemen succeed at reducing immediate suffering. They fail to fully solve the problem of long-term governance. They stabilize chaos. They do not eliminate it, and that distinction sits at the core of their identity. Because ultimately, the Minutemen are not a nation in the traditional sense. They are a promise that people might still help each other, even when the world has every reason not to. But promises are not infrastructure, and infrastructure is what determines whether civilizations endure. The deeper you examine the Minutemen, the more you start to realize that their biggest strength is not organization, not firepower, and not even leadership. It is belief. Belief that cooperation can outlast chaos. Belief that people, if given enough reason and enough protection, will choose to help each other instead of tearing each other apart. Belief that civilization does not have to be rebuilt through domination or control, but can instead emerge naturally from mutual aid. That belief sounds almost obvious when stated in isolation, almost harmless, almost self-evident. But Fallout 4 is not an environment where beliefs survive unchallenged. It is a world that constantly tests whether ideals can survive contact with reality. And the Minutemen philosophy of niceness is tested more harshly than almost any other idea in the game. Because niceness, in the Minutemen sense, is not just emotional kindness. It is an entire political assumption disguised as morality. It assumes that if people are supported, they will cooperate. It assumes that if communities are protected, they will stabilize. It assumes that if violence is reduced, civilization will naturally grow in its place. In normal conditions, those assumptions can hold. History actually provides many examples of cooperative societies emerging from shared hardship when resources are sufficient and threats are manageable. But the Commonwealth is not a normal environment. It is a post-collapse ecosystem where scarcity is constant, threats are unpredictable, and trust has been repeatedly broken across generations. In that kind of environment, niceness stops being a soft virtue and becomes a structural gamble, because every act of trust is also an exposure to risk. Every cooperative agreement depends on enforcement mechanisms that the Minutemen often do not fully possess. Every settlement that agrees to work with the network does so partly because of goodwill, but also because of immediate survival incentives that can shift at any moment. That is why the Minutemen feel so emotionally powerful and so structurally unstable at the same time. They are constantly betting that short-term cooperation will naturally evolve into long-term stability, but evolution in systems is not guaranteed to move toward order. It often moves toward whichever configuration best survives current pressures. And in the Commonwealth, current pressures are almost always violent, immediate, and unpredictable. This is where Preston Garvey becomes more than just a narrative device. He becomes a philosophical anchor for the entire faction. Preston does not think in terms of systems first. He thinks in terms of people first. A settlement is under attack. A family is displaced. A trade route is unsafe. His instinct is always immediate intervention. And that instinct is morally correct in the moment. But morality in the moment does not automatically scale into governance over time, because every immediate solution creates new long-term demands. A settlement saved today still needs protection tomorrow. A trade route secured today still needs maintenance next week. A community stabilized today can destabilize again if broader conditions remain unchanged. Preston's leadership style, therefore, becomes a cycle of continuous emergency response, and that cycle defines the entire Minutemen structure, always reacting, rarely consolidating, constantly expanding obligations without equivalent expansion in institutional capacity. This is where the philosophy of niceness begins to reveal its hidden cost. Because niceness, when scaled without infrastructure, turns into obligation without limit. Every person helped becomes another responsibility. Every settlement secured becomes another dependency. Every victory creates additional maintenance requirements. And, unlike structured governments, the Minutemen have very few mechanisms for refusing or redistributing those obligations. They rarely say no. And saying no is one of the most important functions of any stable system, because no prevents overload, no prevents collapse under expansion, no protects internal cohesion. But the Minutemen, by design and philosophy, struggle with that boundary. They exist in a constant state of moral expansion, where every new crisis demands attention and every act of refusal feels like abandonment. So the system grows outward endlessly until the center becomes stretched thin. This is where the comparison to other factions becomes unavoidable, because each major faction in Fallout 4 solves this scaling problem in a radically different way. The Brotherhood of Steel solves it through restriction. They limit who counts as part of their moral and operational universe. Outsiders are not their responsibility unless strategically relevant. That allows them to maintain focus and internal stability, but it also produces exclusion and authoritarian behavior. The Institute solves it through abstraction. They remove themselves from surface responsibility entirely, treating humanity as a variable rather than a population. That allows extreme efficiency, but destroys moral accountability. The Railroad solves it through specialization. They narrow their purpose so aggressively that scaling becomes irrelevant. They do one thing very well, but refuse to govern broadly. The Minutemen do none of these things. They expand responsibility instead of narrowing it. They maintain moral inclusion instead of exclusion. They reject abstraction in favor of personal connection. And that combination while ethically admirable, produces one unavoidable outcome under sustained pressure: overextension. The Minutemen are always one crisis away from being stretched beyond what they can realistically handle. And Fallout 4 repeatedly demonstrates that reality through gameplay structure itself. No matter how strong the network becomes, new distress signals appear, new settlements need help, new threats emerge, new logistical demands arise. There is no final point where the Minutemen stop expanding and start maintaining equilibrium naturally, because equilibrium is not built into their design. This is also why the faction feels so dependent on the sole survivor in practice. The player becomes the only truly scalable problem solver in the system. Every limitation in manpower, coordination, and logistics is bypassed through player intervention, but that creates an artificial sense of capability that does not translate into independent systemic stability. Without that external force, the structure reveals its fragility, and that fragility is not accidental. It is embedded in the philosophy itself. Because niceness, when treated as a governing principle, assumes that moral intent is enough to compensate for structural weakness. But moral intent does not automatically generate infrastructure. It does not create supply chains. It does not build administrative institutions. It does not enforce consistency across large regions. It does not solve coordination problems at scale. It only motivates action. And motivation, while powerful, is not self-sustaining in complex systems. At some point, systems require mechanisms that operate independently of emotional intensity. This is where the Minutemen begin to resemble a philosophical experiment more than a traditional faction. They test whether a society can be rebuilt primarily through decentralized goodwill rather than centralized control. And the answer Fallout 4 gives is intentionally ambiguous, but heavily weighted towards skepticism, because every time the Minutemen expand, the same structural pressures reappear: resource limitations, communication delays, local autonomy conflicts, security vulnerabilities, leadership dependency. These are not temporary issues caused by bad luck or poor execution. They are structural consequences of the chosen model itself. And the game quietly reinforces this through tone rather than explicit dialogue. Settlers remain anxious even after liberation. Trade routes remain dangerous even after stabilization. Outposts remain vulnerable even after reinforcement. There is always another problem waiting just beyond the horizon. This is the environment in which Preston's philosophy operates. A world where doing good is never enough to permanently resolve the conditions requiring goodness in the first place, which creates a subtle but persistent emotional contradiction inside the Minutemen identity. They are constantly succeeding at individual tasks while never fully solving the broader system those tasks belong to. Every victory feels real, but every victory also feels temporary. And that is the psychological space where the faction lives, between meaningful impact and structural insufficiency, between moral clarity and logistical limitation, between hope and fragility. The philosophy of niceness does not fail because it is wrong. It struggles because it assumes a level of stability that the Commonwealth does not provide. It assumes that cooperation can scale without coercion, that goodwill can persist without enforcement, that decentralized effort can replace centralized systems. And Fallout 4 keeps showing, again and again, how fragile those assumptions become under sustained pressure. Not immediately, not dramatically, but gradually, through accumulation, through repetition, through the slow weight of endless small crises that never fully stop coming. And that is why the Minutemen feel both inspiring and unsettling at the same time. Because they represent the idea that humanity can remain fundamentally good even after collapse, but they also represent the reality that goodness alone may not be enough to rebuild what was lost, and that tension is never fully resolved. It just persists, quietly, underneath every broadcast from Radio Freedom and every settlement that asks for help again and again, not because the Minutemen are failing in any simple sense, But because the world they are trying to fix was never built to be fixed through niceness alone, and the longer you sit with that contradiction, the more the Minutemen stop feeling like a faction in the traditional sense and start feeling like a question the game is asking the player over and over again in slightly different forms. What if survival depended on cooperation instead of control? What if kindness was not just a moral choice but a governing strategy? What if refusing to become authoritarian is not just an ethical stance, but a structural disadvantage in a world that rewards force? Fallout never answers these questions directly, because the answers would flatten the tension the entire world is built on. Instead, it keeps presenting scenarios where niceness works just enough to be convincing, but not enough to be fully secure. A settlement is saved, a community is rebuilt, a trade route is reopened, a radio broadcast restores hope, and for a moment, it feels like the philosophy is working. But then the system continues, and continuation is where stress accumulates. Because the Minutemen are not operating in a static environment where problems are solved and then removed from the equation. They are operating in a living system of recurring instability, where every solution becomes the foundation for the next problem. A defended settlement does not end vulnerability, it shifts it. A secured region does not end violence, it displaces it. A restored supply line does not end scarcity, it redistributes it unevenly. This is what makes the Commonwealth such a brutal testing ground for any idealistic political philosophy. It does not allow resolution to stay resolved for long. And that is where niceness, as a governing principle, begins to show its deepest limitation. Because niceness is reactive by nature, it responds to suffering after it appears. It alleviates harm once it is already in motion. It comforts, repairs, and stabilizes, but it does not easily prevent systemic recurrence unless it is supported by strong institutions. And the Minutemen, by design, avoid building those stronger institutions in any rigid or coercive sense. So the result is a structure that is incredibly effective at producing moments of relief, but far less effective at eliminating the conditions that require relief in the first place. This is why so many Minutemen missions feel repetitive from a systemic perspective. Even if they are emotionally varied, the underlying loop remains the same. Crisis emerges, intervention happens. Crisis temporarily resolves. Another crisis emerges elsewhere. It is not a story of progression, it is a story of containment, and containment, no matter how successful, is always vulnerable to scale. The more territory the Minutemen influence, the more simultaneous crises exist. The more settlements they protect, the more obligations they accumulate. The more hope they generate, the more expectations they must continuously meet. Hope itself becomes a form of pressure, because hope increases dependency, and dependency increases vulnerability. This creates a feedback loop that is almost invisible at first, but becomes more obvious the longer the system expands. The Minutemen become more trusted, which makes more people rely on them, which increases their workload, which stretches their capacity, which increases the likelihood of failure, which then risks undermining the trust they originally built. It is a cycle that can sustain itself for a time, but not indefinitely without structural reinforcement. And that is the point where Fallout 4 quietly shifts from portraying the Minutemen as purely inspirational to something more complicated. Because inspiration alone cannot stabilize a collapsing region forever. At some point, inspiration has to be converted into durable systems, or it begins to erode under its own weight. This is where the absence of strong institutional architecture inside the Minutemen becomes most visible. There is no formalized administrative class handling logistics at scale. No standardized economic system integrating settlements into a unified structure. No consistent legal framework resolving disputes between communities. No long-term planning body operating independently of emergency response cycles. Everything flows through immediate need and immediate reaction, and that immediacy defines both their strength and their limitation. They are fast to respond, flexible in crisis, emotionally accessible, but they lack the slower, less visible mechanisms that civilizations rely on to persist beyond the presence of exceptional individuals. Which brings the discussion back again to leadership dependency, because the Minutemen are ultimately structured around a single, extraordinary stabilizing force. The sole survivor does not just lead them. The sole survivor effectively replaces the missing institutional depth. Every gap in logistics, coordination, and enforcement is bridged through player action. Every structural weakness is temporarily bypassed through individual intervention, and that works within the logic of a game. But within the logic of a civilization, it highlights how fragile the system actually is. Because no real society can rely indefinitely on a single coordinating intelligence to maintain coherence across an entire region. Eventually, delegation becomes necessary. Eventually, systems must operate independently of heroic oversight. Eventually, institutions must function even when key individuals are absent. The Minutemen do not convincingly demonstrate that transition. They remain anchored to the presence of an active problem solver, which means their stability is conditional rather than permanent, and conditional stability is always vulnerable to disruption. This is where the philosophy of niceness reaches its most difficult contradiction, because niceness depends on individuals continuing to care, but individuals do not remain constant. They change, they burn out, they lose motivation, they die. And when that happens, systems built primarily on emotional continuity begin to weaken. The Minutemen, as a result, are constantly balanced on a human variable that cannot be guaranteed across time. That does not make them a failure in any simple sense. It makes them a system that is deeply sensitive to the emotional state of its participants. And sensitivity is not the same thing as stability. It can produce beautiful outcomes. It can produce meaningful survival, but it struggles to guarantee continuity across generations, which is why the Minutemen feel so powerful in the moment and so uncertain in the long term. They excel at immediate moral action. They struggle with structural permanence, and Fallout 4 never fully resolves that contradiction, because the contradiction itself is the point. The game is not asking whether niceness works in ideal conditions. It is asking whether niceness can survive in conditions that actively undermine it. And the answer it repeatedly suggests is not a clean yes or no. It is a pattern. Niceness works until it is overwhelmed. Then it adapts. Then it works again. Then it is overwhelmed again. It is a cycle of partial success rather than final resolution. And that cycle defines the entire emotional architecture of the Minutemen. They are not a solution to the Commonwealth. They are a method of coping with it, a way of reducing suffering without eliminating its source, a way of preserving dignity without securing permanence. And that distinction is what keeps them from ever becoming truly comparable to the more structurally dominant factions in the world. Because in Fallout, dominance is not just about morality or firepower. It is about whether a system can persist when individual effort is removed from the equation. And the Minutemen, more than almost any other faction, are defined by what happens when that effort is the only thing holding everything together. And if you push that idea far enough, something even more uncomfortable starts to emerge underneath the Minutemen philosophy. Because niceness, when it becomes a governing system instead of a personal virtue, stops being purely about kindness. It becomes about distribution of responsibility. Who carries risk? Who absorbs failure? Who responds when things go wrong? In the Minutemen model, that responsibility is pushed upward toward whoever is most capable in the moment. In practice, that becomes the sole survivor. In theory, it becomes the idea of a shared collective duty. But shared duty only works when participation is consistent across time and evenly distributed across participants. The Commonwealth does not provide that consistency. Some settlements are stable and cooperative, others are isolated and desperate. Some regions are densely populated with overlapping support networks. Others are essentially abandoned pockets of survival. That unevenness means the Minutemen are constantly correcting imbalance rather than operating within a stable framework. And correction is exhausting when it never ends. This is where the emotional tone of the faction begins to take on a slightly different texture. At first, the Minutemen feel like hope. Then they feel like effort. Then, over time, they start to feel like responsibility that never fully resolves into relief. There is always another call for help, always another settlement under pressure, always another problem waiting just outside the current moment. And because the system is built on responsiveness rather than prevention, it rarely reaches a point where those calls meaningfully decrease in frequency. Instead, success increases visibility. The more effective the Minutemen become, the more people rely on them. The more people rely on them, the more demands accumulate. The more demands accumulate, the more stretched the system becomes. So success feeds into strain, and strain feeds into fragility. That is one of the most quietly paradoxical aspects of the entire faction. Improving their reputation does not reduce their workload, it expands it, which is almost the opposite of how stable institutions are supposed to function. In a mature system, increased stability leads to decreased emergency demand. Problems become less frequent because underlying conditions improve structurally. But the Minutemen do not significantly alter those underlying conditions at scale. They suppress instability locally. They do not eliminate the systems that generate instability regionally. So the baseline level of chaos in the Commonwealth remains relatively constant, which means their success primarily increases their exposure to that chaos rather than reducing it. And that creates a situation where moral success and structural success diverge. Morally, they are winning more people's trust. Structurally, they are not reducing total system entropy in a meaningful long-term way. That divergence is where the philosophy of niceness becomes most strained, because niceness assumes that doing good reduces the need for more good over time. But in the Minutemen system, doing good often reveals more areas where good is needed. It expands the visible horizon of suffering rather than shrinking it. This is why the Commonwealth never feels fully resolved, even at the height of Minutemen influence. There is always more map left to stabilize, always more settlements that can be improved, always more threats that can re-emerge in slightly different forms. The world remains structurally open-ended in a way that mirrors the open-endedness of the faction's responsibilities. And open-ended responsibility without structural closure is one of the most exhausting configurations a system can produce, because it eliminates the psychological endpoint where effort transitions into maintenance. Instead, effort remains constant. Maintenance never stabilizes into routine. Everything stays in a state of partial emergency management, and over time, that state becomes normalized, which means the Minutemen are not just a faction responding to crisis. They are a faction living inside crisis as a permanent condition, and that permanence reshapes what their philosophy of niceness actually means in practice. It stops being about occasional acts of kindness and becomes about sustained emotional labor across an unstable landscape, helping not once, but repeatedly, without structural reduction in demand. This is where the sole survivor dependency becomes even more significant, because the player character is not just filling logistical gaps, they are absorbing emotional and systemic overflow. Every unresolved issue funnels toward a single point of agency. Every instability converges on one decision maker. Every breakdown of local structure escalates upward to individual intervention. That is not decentralization. That is bottlenecked centralization disguised as volunteer coordination. And it works only as long as that bottleneck exists in the form of an exceptionally capable individual. Which is why the Minutemen feel so fragile beneath their optimistic framing. Because remove the individual, and the system does not gradually degrade. It collapses into uncoordinated fragments almost immediately. This is the core structural vulnerability hidden beneath the philosophy of niceness. It does not scale horizontally on its own. It scales vertically through exceptional intervention, and vertical scaling is always temporary unless it eventually becomes institutionalized, which the Minutemen never fully achieve. Instead, they remain permanently dependent on extraordinary effort replacing ordinary structure, and extraordinary effort is not reproducible across generations. It is not predictable, it is not stable, it is not reliable in the way civilizations require reliability. So the faction exists in a constant tension between what it wants to be and what it actually is capable of sustaining. It wants to be a network of mutual aid, but it behaves more like a crisis response organism. It wants to represent decentralized strength, but it relies on centralized execution. It wants to embody collective resilience, but it depends on individual overload. And Fallout 4 never fully resolves that contradiction, because resolving it would require fundamentally redesigning what the Minutemen are at their core. Instead, the game leaves them suspended in that unresolved space, functional enough to matter, fragile enough to question, hopeful enough to believe in, and unstable enough to worry about. Which is why, even after extended rebuilding, the Minutemen never quite feel like they have moved beyond the logic of collapse. They are still reacting to it, still shaped by it, still defined by it, not as victims of it, but as managers of it. And that is perhaps the most precise way to understand what the philosophy of niceness becomes in the Commonwealth. It is not the absence of power, it is the refusal to concentrate it. And that refusal produces a system that can help many people, but cannot fully stabilize the world those people live in. Because stability in Fallout's universe often requires the very kinds of concentrated authority the Minutemen are philosophically uncomfortable becoming, and so they remain caught in the space between moral purity and structural necessity, helping enough to matter, but not enough to finish the job. And that unfinished nature is not a flaw in execution. It is the logical outcome of their philosophy extended across an entire collapsing region, a philosophy that values kindness above control and immediacy above permanence, which means every act of saving the Commonwealth is also an act of postponing its deeper transformation into something more structurally coherent. And the longer that postponement continues, the more obvious it becomes that the Minutemen are not building a new world. They are simply keeping the old one from falling apart completely, again and again, without end, without final resolution, just continuation. And when you extend that thought even further, you start to see something uncomfortable about how the Minutemen change the player's perception of responsibility itself. Because in most faction stories, responsibility feels defined. You belong to a structure. You follow a chain of command. You act within a system that has limits, roles, and expectations. But the Minutemen blur all of that. They give you authority without boundaries, responsibility without clear limits, power without a fully formed institution to distribute it through. And that creates a very specific psychological shift over time. You stop feeling like a member of a faction. You start feeling like the faction itself. Not because the Minutemen are strong enough to justify that role, but because there is no other structure strong enough to absorb it. Every unresolved problem eventually becomes your problem. Every unstable region eventually becomes your responsibility. Every settlement eventually becomes something you are expected to stabilize personally. And that accumulation changes the tone of the entire experience. At first, it feels empowering. Then it becomes routine. Then it becomes expectation, and eventually it becomes burden. Not because the tasks themselves change, but because the system never develops a layer above you that can meaningfully share or absorb that workload. This is where the philosophy of niceness becomes almost paradoxical in practice, because it removes barriers between people in a moral sense, but it also removes buffers in a structural sense. In a more hierarchical system, responsibility is distributed through layers of authority. Orders are filtered. Decisions are delegated. Accountability is shared across ranks and institutions. In the Minutemen, that buffering layer is extremely thin, so moral accessibility translates directly into operational overload. You are not just helping the Commonwealth. You are holding it together manually. And that distinction matters, because holding something together manually is not the same as building a system that holds itself together. Manual stability is always temporary. It depends entirely on continuous attention. The moment attention shifts, gaps appear immediately. And the Commonwealth is full of those gaps. Geographic gaps between settlements, logistical gaps in supply chains, political gaps in authority, security gaps in enforcement, communication gaps across distance. The Minutemen attempt to bridge all of them through presence. But presence is not scalable in the way infrastructure is. You can be in one place at a time. You can respond to one crisis at a time. You can stabilize one situation at a time. Meanwhile, the Commonwealth generates multiple, simultaneous instabilities constantly, so even at peak efficiency, there is always more demand than capacity. And that imbalance is not something better planning fully resolves within the framework the Minutemen operate in. It is structural, which is why the faction feels like it is always slightly behind the world it is trying to stabilize, not failing outright, but never quite catching up. And that feeling becomes more pronounced the longer you imagine the Commonwealth continuing beyond the main story. Because once the major faction conflicts are resolved, what remains is not resolution but maintenance, a constant cycle of minor crises, borderline emergencies, localized breakdowns, requiring constant intervention to prevent escalation. The Minutemen are extremely good at intervention, but intervention is not the same as resolution. Intervention stops immediate collapse. It does not necessarily eliminate the causes of collapse, which means the system resets to instability over and over again at smaller scales. This is why even successful Minutemen control of the Commonwealth does not feel like transformation into a stable nation-state. It feels like continuous damage control across a permanently unstable landscape. And that landscape shapes the philosophy back onto itself. Because when a system is always in crisis response mode, it begins to define success as simply preventing total failure, not achieving improvement, not reaching stability, just avoiding collapse. And that shift in definition is subtle but important, because it lowers the ceiling of what victory even means. Victory stops being a final condition. It becomes a temporary state between disruptions. And in that framing, the Minutemen are not building toward an endpoint. They are maintaining a threshold, a line the Commonwealth must not fall below, but never fully rises above in a permanent sense. And that threshold existence is exhausting for any system, because it never allows closure. No completion point, no final stabilization. No moment where responsibility meaningfully decreases, just continuous vigilance, continuous response, continuous adjustment, which brings everything back again to the philosophy of niceness, because niceness in the Minutemen sense is fundamentally reactive. It reacts to suffering, it reacts to instability, it reacts to breakdown, but it does not inherently generate a mechanism for eliminating the underlying drivers of those conditions at scale. And that means the Commonwealth remains structurally productive of the very crises the Minutemen are trying to solve, not because anyone is failing, but because the system itself is not redesigned at a deep enough level to stop producing instability in the first place. So the Minutemen end up occupying a very specific role in the Commonwealth's long-term structure. They are not reformers in the full sense. They are stabilizers. They reduce the amplitude of collapse. They do not remove collapse as a recurring possibility. And that is where their emotional identity and structural identity quietly diverge. Emotionally, they feel like restoration. Structurally, they function as mitigation. Emotionally, they suggest rebuilding. Structurally, they deliver management. And that gap between perception and function is what creates so much of the lingering ambiguity around them, because players are encouraged to feel like they are rebuilding civilization. But what they are actually doing, at scale, is managing an ongoing breakdown in more humane ways. That is not a small achievement, but it is also not the same as establishing a stable post-collapse society. And Fallout 4 never forces that distinction into a single, explicit conclusion, because the ambiguity is part of the faction's design. It lets the Minutemen remain emotionally uplifting while structurally incomplete, hopeful in tone, uncertain in outcome, and that combination is exactly what makes them so difficult to categorize cleanly within the world of Fallout, because they are neither a failure nor a full success. They are something in between, a system that works only as long as the conditions around it remain unstable enough to require constant intervention, but not so unstable that intervention becomes impossible. And that narrow window is where the entire philosophy of niceness lives in the Commonwealth. Between chaos and collapse, between effort and exhaustion, between hope and limitation, always balancing, never fully resolving. When you finally step back from all the systems, all the comparisons, all the mechanics, and all the structural contradictions, the Minutemen stop being just a faction you can evaluate in terms of efficiency or power. They become something closer to a reflection of what you believe survival should look like when everything else has already failed. Because in the end, the Minutemen are not defined by what they are capable of enforcing. They are defined by what they refuse to become. They refuse to become an empire. They refuse to become a technocracy. They refuse to become an authoritarian military state. They refuse to turn survival into domination. And in the world of Fallout, that refusal is not a neutral choice. It is a defining limitation that shapes everything else they can and cannot do. Because every other major power in the Commonwealth solves the problem of instability by narrowing humanity into something more controllable. The Brotherhood narrows humanity into hierarchy. The Institute narrows humanity into experiment and observation. The Railroad narrows humanity into a single moral mission, so focused that it avoids broader governance entirely. The Minutemen do the opposite. They expand responsibility outward until it covers almost everyone they can reach. And that expansion is where their strength and weakness become indistinguishable from each other, because expansion feels morally correct, but it is structurally expensive. The more people you include, the more situations you are responsible for. The more situations you are responsible for, the more points of failure you introduce. The more points of failure you introduce, the more constantly you must intervene, until intervention itself becomes the primary function of the system. And that is where the Minutemen ultimately settle, not as builders of a new civilization, but as permanent responders to the collapse of an old one that never fully stops collapsing. Even after victory, even after the Institute is gone, even after the Commonwealth is secured, the world does not transform into stability. It transforms into managed instability. And that difference is subtle enough that it can feel like progress at first, because fewer people are dying, more settlements are surviving, trade routes are safer, communities are more connected, hope is more visible. But underneath all of that, the underlying conditions that generate instability are still present. Scarcity is still present, fragmentation is still present, isolation is still present. Violence has not been eliminated, only reduced in intensity and frequency, which means the Minutemen are not erasing the causes of collapse. They are buffering their effects, and buffering is not the same as resolution. It is delay, compassionate delay, but still delay. This is why the Minutemen ending feels so emotionally layered, even when it is presented as the good ending of Fallout 4, because it delivers exactly what it promises on a human level. People are helped, communities are protected, civilians are less alone. There is genuine improvement in lived experience across the Commonwealth. But at the same time, the structural questions remain unanswered in a very quiet way. What holds everything together without the player? What happens when crises outpace response again? What prevents fragmentation from slowly reasserting itself once momentum fades? What replaces emergency intervention as the primary mode of governance? The game does not fully answer these questions, because the Minutemen themselves do not fully answer them either. They exist in a space where action is prioritized over architecture, where response is prioritized over design, where immediate survival is prioritized over long-term system building. And that prioritization is understandable in a world like the Commonwealth, but it comes with consequences that are never fully resolved, because systems built around response tend to remain permanently reactive. And reactive systems are always one step behind the conditions they are trying to manage. That is why, even at their peak, the Minutemen feel less like a finished civilization and more like a sustained effort to keep civilization from falling apart completely. Not a foundation, a brace, not a structure, a support, something holding weight without ever becoming the thing that defines what the weight rests on. And that is where the philosophical identity of the faction ultimately settles. The Minutemen are not the answer to the Commonwealth. They are the refusal to abandon it. They are the decision that collapse should not be met with indifference, even if it cannot be fully reversed. They are the idea that people helping each other, even imperfectly and inconsistently, still matters in a world that has already lost most of its guarantees. And that idea is powerful, not because it is structurally sufficient, but because it is emotionally resistant to despair. It refuses the logic that says only domination or detachment can survive long-term. It insists that cooperation, even in fragile form, still has value, even when it is stretched thin, even when it is overwhelmed, even when it is dependent on individuals rather than institutions, even when it cannot guarantee permanence. But Fallout 4 quietly frames that insistence inside a world that constantly pressures it toward breaking point. And that tension is never fully resolved because it is not meant to be. The Minutemen do not exist to prove that niceness is enough. They exist to show what niceness looks like when it is asked to carry more than it was ever designed to support. And the answer is not collapse, but it is also not stability. It is endurance, uneven, fragile, persistent, held together by repeated acts of intervention rather than permanent structure. And that is where the story ultimately leaves them, not as conquerors of the wasteland, not as architects of a new world, but as people continuing to act in a world that has not stopped, requiring action long after clarity fades, long after certainty disappears, long after every easy version of the future has already been rejected by reality. And maybe that is the final, quiet truth underneath everything. The Minutemen are not what rebuilds the Commonwealth. They are what prevents it from giving up entirely, while something better still has a chance to exist somewhere beyond it. Even if that better thing is never guaranteed, even if it never fully arrives, and even if all that remains is the ongoing decision to keep trying anyway in a world that never stops making that decision difficult.